Beneath the layers of stone and time, the Earth keeps secrets of creatures that once ruled with thunderous steps. Some dinosaurs from Earth's distant past seem so strange, so otherworldly, that they blur the line between science and myth. With towering crests, shimmering feathers, sail-like backs, and horned faces, they could have stepped straight from the pages of legend. In this video, we'll explore the most mystic dinosaurs that could have really existed. Before we start, let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there now. Now, prepare for a journey back to the prehistoric era. The concept of mystic dinosaurs begins at a strange crossroads, where bones pulled from the earth meet the stories whispered around ancient fires. When people first stumbled upon enormous fossilized bones, they did not have the tools of modern science to explain them. They did not know about species that lived millions of years before humans walked the earth. Instead, they looked at the massive ribs, skulls, and claws and placed them into the framework of the stories they already carried. In that act of weaving, something fascinating happened. Dinosaurs that had truly existed in deep time began to blur into creatures of myth, merging with dragons, giants, thunder beasts, and gods of old. In the rolling hills of ancient Greece, shepherds and farmers often came across bones of strange size, far too large to belong to any creature they knew. The skull of a Protoeratops with its beak-like mouth and broad frill might have seemed to them like the skull of a griffin, that legendary beast said to guard treasures in the desert sands. A fossilized femur of some enormous prehistoric creature might have been thought to be the thigh bone of a fallen giant who once strode the earth during the Age of Heroes. To people of that time, who lived in a world filled with stories of gods battling titans and beasts lurking in mountains, it was not a leap of imagination to assign mythic qualities to the silent, stony remains. They did not see extinction and evolution. They saw proof of legends that had always been told. The blending of fossils with folklore happened not only in Greece, but in many parts of the world. In the dry deserts of Central Asia, travellers along the Silk Road told tales of griffins guarding gold. Some historians believe these tales may have been sparked by the sight of Protoceratops fossils half buried in the sand, their parrot-like faces and clawed limbs looking unlike any animal alive. To nomadic traders, these bones were not remnants of creatures from a forgotten geological age, but guardians of riches, proof that the earth was filled with beings beyond human understanding. What today can be identified as remnants of a ceratopsian dinosaur they saw as part of a living myth. In China, enormous bones unearthed from the ground were often sold as dragon bones. Farmers and herbalists ground them into powders for medicine, believing they carried the power of these mighty beings. For centuries, people held these fossils in their hands without ever realizing they belonged to creatures that walked the earth tens of millions of years earlier. The long curved teeth of theropods were taken as dragon fangs. The vertebrae of sauropods looked like the bones of serpentine beasts that could soar through the skies. By the time scholars began carefully collecting these bones, much of their identity had already been wrapped in layers of dragon lore, creating a curious overlap between fact and fantasy. Even in Europe during the Middle Ages, when people dug up giant bones, they often claimed they were the remains of biblical giants or dragons slain by saints. A huge fossilized femur might be displayed in a cathedral as proof that legendary creatures once roamed the countryside. The dragon slain by St. George, so often painted on church walls, may not have been born only from imagination but also from encounters with fossils that seem to confirm the existence of such beasts. The overlap between sacred stories, folk legends, and paleontological remains formed a fertile ground where mystic dinosaurs were born. The fascination with these mysterious bones did not fade with the arrival of modern science. When early naturalists in the 18th and 19th centuries began piecing together the skeletons of dinosaurs, the public viewed these reconstructions with awe and terror. Enormous beasts towering over human figures looked like the dragons and monsters that had haunted humanity's dreams for millennia. Some paleontologists even leaned into that imagery, describing creatures with words borrowed from mythology. The term dinosaur, coined in the 19th century, meant terrible lizard, a phrase that carried both scientific precision and echoes of fearsome legends. The blurring of myth and science becomes even more vivid when one considers how incomplete fossil records left gaps in knowledge. Early reconstructions sometimes gave dinosaurs a monstrous dragon-like appearance, with too many horns, spines, or incorrect body shapes. A toothless skull might be paired with claws that did not belong to it, creating a chimera that resembled the hybrid creatures of ancient myths. The line between evidence and imagination was thin, and through it emerged visions of creatures that felt half real, half mystical. There is something profoundly human about this blending. When faced with the incomprehensible scale of geological time and the sheer strangeness of creatures that no longer live among us, people often turn to familiar symbols to explain them. A sauropod with its neck stretching into the treetops recalls serpentine dragons winding through clouds. A Stegosaurus with its back plates might resemble a spiny demon or armoured monster. A pterosaur swooping through prehistoric skies resembles the Thunderbirds of Native American lore, great winged beings said to control storms and lightning. The similarities are not precise, yet they are close enough that myth and fossil seem to echo one another across time. The idea of mystic dinosaurs also raises interesting questions about how ancient people might have interacted with fossils. Consider a tribe that discovered a large skull eroding from a cliffside. They might touch it, carve symbols near it, and create rituals around it. The skull becomes a sacred object, not merely a stone but the head of a creature that existed outside the ordinary boundaries of life and death. For them, it is not just a curiosity, it is proof that the earth itself hides beings of immense power. Whether they called it a dragon, a god, or a beast of the underworld, the fossil became part of their cultural memory. There are also tales from North America, where native peoples encountered fossils and interpreted them through their own stories. The Pawnee spoke of great thunderbirds whose bones could be found in certain hills. Some tribes told of water monsters that lived in lakes and rivers, descriptions that resemble mosasaurs or plesiosaurs, marine reptiles whose fossils are found in those regions. For them, these bones were not evidence of extinct species in a scientific sense, but signs that the spirits of these powerful beings still lingered in the land. As paleontology advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries, scientists began to build clearer pictures of dinosaurs, but even then the public imagination held on to the mystic aura. Novels and paintings depicted them as dragon-like monsters, symbols of untamed power and forgotten ages. When the first dinosaur skeletons were displayed in museums, crowds marveled not just at the science, but at the awe these creatures inspired, the same awe that once surrounded myths of dragons and giants. The bones had shifted from the world of folklore into the halls of science, yet they carried with them a lingering trace of mystery. This blending of myth and fossil also reflects something deeper about how humans view the unknown. Myths are not random inventions. They often arise from encounters with things that defy explanation. A flash of lightning becomes the weapon of a sky god. A massive fossil bone becomes the leg of a giant. A strange claw eroding from rock becomes proof of a dragon. The natural world provides the raw material, and human imagination builds upon it, creating stories that persist through generations. Dinosaurs, hidden beneath layers of earth, provided some of the most striking raw material of all. It is worth reflecting on how myths themselves sometimes prepared the ground for the acceptance of dinosaurs. When people heard of scientists uncovering huge lizard-like creatures from the deep past, it did not seem entirely foreign. After all, dragons had always existed in their stories. The discovery of real dinosaurs gave new life to these legends, as if the myths were being confirmed in stone. This interplay between folklore and science gave rise to a cultural landscape where mystic dinosaurs could thrive. The visual similarities between certain dinosaurs and mythological creatures deepen this blending. Consider the long, slender bodies of sauropods, resembling serpentine dragons. The horned face of a Triceratops recalls the demons and monsters of many traditions. The massive wingspans of pterosaurs conjure images of winged beasts that blot out the sun. Even the mighty Tyrannosaurus, with its enormous jaws and bone-crushing teeth, could easily step into the role of a dragon from any medieval tale. These resemblances are not exact, but they are strong enough to keep the boundary between myth and fossil forever hazy. Beyond the physical resemblances, there is also the emotional response. Dinosaurs, whether viewed scientifically or mythically, evoke awe, fear, and wonder. They are larger than life, reminders of a world not shaped for human comfort. Myths of dragons often carry similar emotions. They represent chaos, danger, and majesty. The fusion of these two, fossil and legend, creates creatures that feel both grounded in reality and lifted into the realm of myth. Dragons and dinosaurs stand at the strange crossroads where science and myth meet, one born from the ancient bones of creatures that truly walk the earth, and the other carried in the tales of storytellers who lived thousands of years ago. Across almost every culture in the world there are myths of dragons, enormous beasts with scales, teeth like knives, claws like spears, and wings that could blot out the sun. These creatures could breathe fire, fly through the air, or crawl like monstrous serpents. They terrified people in legends, guarded treasures, destroyed villages, or served as symbols of divine power. When people from different lands and different times are compared, it becomes striking that so many of these tales share common features, even though the people telling them often had no contact with one another. One possible explanation that many historians and scientists have considered is that the myths of dragons may not have been created entirely from imagination alone. They may have been born when ancient people stumbled across the bones and fossils of long-dead animals that were far bigger and stranger than anything living in their own time. Imagine a farmer in ancient China digging into the earth to prepare for planting and finding a huge curved bone longer than his own body. To his eyes, it would not look like the leg of a cow or the rib of a horse. It would look alien, something almost otherworldly, and the only way to make sense of it would be to place it in the world of myth. In China, where dragons were seen not as evil monsters but as powerful, wise, and even benevolent beings connected to rain and rivers, such bones may have been believed to be the remains of those celestial creatures. There are records from more than 2,000 years ago of what were called dragon bones being dug from the ground, kept in temples, or ground into powder for use in traditional medicine. What modern paleontologists now recognise as the fossilised remains of dinosaurs were at that time taken as physical proof that dragons had once roamed the earth. Across the world in Greece, shepherds and travellers may have found fossilised skulls of mammoths or mastodons with huge central cavities where the trunk once attached. To people who had never seen such animals alive, the bones could easily look like the skull of a giant one-eyed man. This may have helped inspire the myths of the Cyclops, huge beings with a single eye in the middle of their forehead. And when bones belonging to massive dinosaurs were found, the natural way to explain them was to place them in the stories of beasts that could not be explained by ordinary nature. The Greeks spoke of monsters slain by their heroes, such as the serpent-like Hydra destroyed by Heracles, or the dragon Ladon who guarded the golden apples. The fossils scattered across the rocky lands of the Mediterranean may have provided the inspiration for these creatures. In northern Europe, where Viking sagas and Germanic legends took shape, dragons were imagined as vast serpents, coiled around treasures beneath mountains or guarding the roots of the world tree. The land there is rich with deposits of ancient marine reptiles and other fossilised remains, and a warrior or miner who uncovered strange bones could have easily thought them the remnants of these monstrous worms. The story of Beowulf tells of a fire-breathing dragon slain by the hero, and many similar tales spread across Europe. The people of those times did not have the tools of modern science to classify or date fossils. When they saw a massive fossilised tooth or a rib the size of a man's arm, they had to explain it in ways that fit into their worldview. Dragons, giants, and monsters became the answers. In the deserts of Central Asia, the nomadic people who roamed the vast stretches of the Gobi may have been among the first to see what modern scientists now recognise as some of the most complete and spectacular dinosaur fossils in the world. The Gobi Desert is rich in remains of creatures such as Protoceratops, Velociraptor, and other strange forms that lived tens of millions of years ago. For the people who lived there, stumbling across skeletons of horned beasts with parrot-like beaks or clawed predators with curved talons would have been an awe-inspiring experience. Historians believe that these discoveries may have contributed to the enduring stories of the Griffin, a mythical creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. The resemblance between a Protoceratops skull and the beaked head of a bird of prey is striking, and for traders who travelled the Silk Road carrying tales along with their goods, the idea of a half-bird, half-beast guardian of treasure may have been born directly from the fossil bones beneath their feet. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization, stories survive on clay tablets and carved reliefs that speak of monstrous serpents and chaotic dragon-like beings fought by the gods. The tale of Marduk battling the sea dragon Tiamat, a vast serpentine creature representing chaos, stands as one of the oldest dragon myths in the world. The land around Mesopotamia, particularly along river valleys and in arid plains, also yields fossils of ancient creatures. People living thousands of years ago may have seen the weathered bones of prehistoric animals and worked them into their religious imagination, transforming natural relics into symbols of cosmic struggle. In India, where mythology is vast and layered, serpent-like beings called nagas appear in countless stories. They are guardians of hidden treasures, rulers of underground realms, and sometimes divine beings tied to water and fertility. The Indian subcontinent has also yielded fossils of enormous creatures, including the massive sauropods whose remains are still found in central and western parts of the land. For a villager in ancient times who unearthed a thigh bone taller than himself, the connection to serpentine or dragon-like beings in myth would have been natural. The Naga myths, like those of dragons elsewhere, may have roots not only in imagination but also in the strange and awe-inspiring bones hidden in the soil. In the Americas too, myths of enormous serpent beings are widespread. The Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerican cultures, depicted as a feathered serpent with divine qualities, has echoes of dragon myths, even though it took a distinctly different form. The lands of Mexico and the southwestern United States are rich in dinosaur fossils, and for early peoples who encountered them, these bones may have suggested creatures of vast power and strange form. In North America, indigenous tribes have stories of Thunderbirds, enormous winged creatures capable of calling down storms. In some places, fossil beds with the remains of pterosaurs, ancient flying reptiles, have been found near areas where such legends are strong. It is not hard to see how a person who found the fossilized wing bones of a pterosaur could have thought they belonged to a bird of unimaginable size. Even in Africa, where human history runs deeper than anywhere else, myths of great serpents and monstrous beasts appear again and again. From the giant serpent of Dahomey myth to the dragon-like beasts spoken of by the Zulu, the continent's oral traditions carry echoes of creatures beyond ordinary experience. Fossil fields, such as those in the Sahara, have long held the bones of colossal creatures like Spinosaurus and other dinosaurs. For ancient herders, travellers, or hunters who found such remains, the only way to make sense of them would have been to weave them into the stories of monsters that stalked the edges of human life. The idea that fossils helped shape dragon myths is strengthened by how often fossil sites overlap with regions rich in dragon stories. In China, in Mongolia, in Europe, in the Americas, the pattern repeats. The land holds the bones of ancient creatures, and the people of the land tell stories of dragons. To them, bones of dinosaurs with horns or wings or claws would not have been relics of an age they could not imagine, but rather evidence of the creatures they already believed in. The myths, in turn, gave meaning to the fossils, and the fossils gave power to the myths. When European explorers in the Middle Ages encountered fossils, they often took them as proof of biblical creatures. A giant bone could be said to have belonged to one of the Nephilim, the race of giants mentioned in scripture, or to one of the dragons slain by saints in Christian stories. The tale of St. George slaying the dragon became one of the most famous in Europe, and when villagers came across ancient bones, they could easily be tied to such legends. In places like Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, fossilized remains of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs found in the rocks of the Alps were thought to be the skeletons of dragons. These interpretations were taken seriously for centuries, and it was not until modern paleontology developed in the 18th and 19th centuries that scientists began to understand that the bones were from creatures that had lived millions of years before humans. The fascination with dragons survived even into the scientific age. When the first scientifically studied dinosaur bones were described in England in the early 19th century, the word dinosaur had not yet been invented. The fossils were described as belonging to giant lizards or dragon-like beasts. The very first descriptions used language that blurred the line between science and legend, because people could not help but compare the creatures of the distant past with the dragons of the story. When Richard Owen later coined the term dinosaur, meaning terrible lizard, the echo of dragons remained in the way people thought about them. Even today, the connection between dragons and dinosaurs lingers in culture. Films, books, and artworks often depict dragons in ways that resemble dinosaurs, with reptilian scales, massive claws, and bird-like movements. The scientific understanding of dinosaurs as active, often feathered, and highly dynamic creatures has even influenced how modern artists imagine dragons, making them seem more plausible and realistic. The line between the fossil record and the world of myth continues to blur, as our minds naturally join the bones of the past with the stories passed down from our ancestors. The mystery and fear inspired by fossils are powerful. A fossilized tooth the size of a fist could look like the fang of a dragon. A long fossilized rib could be seen as the remains of a wing. A huge skull with sharp teeth might become the head of a fire-breathing beast. For people who did not know about extinction, evolution, or the passage of millions of years, the only reasonable conclusion was that these creatures must have lived at some time, and their myths preserve those memories in symbolic form. The way dragon myths took shape also depended on how each culture saw the world. In China, dragons were benevolent, tied to rain, rivers and fertility, and so fossil bones were proof of sacred creatures. In Europe, dragons were often evil, destructive beings that heroes had to slay, and so fossils were proof of monsters. In the Americas, dragons and serpent-like beings were often tied to creation, storms, or the cycles of life and death, so fossils there may have been woven into cosmological myths. The bones themselves did not tell people what to believe. Rather, people used the bones to confirm what they already thought about the world. Thunder lizards in folklore have always stirred the human mind with feelings of awe, curiosity, and fear. Across the world, from the villages of ancient China to the Great Plains of North America, people have tried to explain the strange shapes of bones and fossils they found buried in the ground, and often they linked them to creatures of legend. What modern scientists now call dinosaur fossils, and the remains of giant prehistoric animals, were once seen as signs of monsters, dragons, and supernatural birds that shook the skies with their wings. The very act of finding a bone larger than the leg of any living beast could fill a person with wonder and raise questions that demanded answers, and those answers often came through stories and myths. In those stories, the bones were not merely remains of creatures that once walked the earth, but evidence of beings that still lived in memory, in dreams, and in the voices of thunder and storms. In China, long before the word dinosaur even existed, farmers digging in the earth sometimes uncovered bones so large that they could hardly believe they belonged to normal animals. These bones, pale and heavy, were given a powerful name, dragon bones. The Chinese dragon was never just a beast in a tale. It was a symbol of strength, rain, and fortune, an animal tied to rivers and storms, a creature that blended snake, fish, eagle, and deer. To hold a dragon bone was to hold a piece of mystery. People ground these bones into powder and used them as medicine, believing they held healing powers that came from the mighty spirit of the dragon itself. Temples stored them, healers prescribed them, and storytellers wove their shapes into the great tapestry of Chinese myths. Some of these so-called dragon bones were in truth the fossilized remains of ancient animals like stegosaurs, hadrosaurs, or mastodons. But the people who saw them had no reason to think in terms of extinct creatures millions of years old. To them, these bones proved that dragons were real, and that they had once walked, swum, and flown across the land. Legends of thunder and lightning also wove themselves into stories of such bones. In China, some bones were linked with heavenly dragons that brought storms. The shaking of the sky during a thunderstorm was said to be the beating of dragon wings or the clash of dragon claws against the clouds. Just as the dragon could soar above the earth, so too could it shake the heavens, and so when farmers heard thunder they thought of these hidden bones beneath their fields, waiting to be discovered as proof of what lived beyond the reach of ordinary eyes. The link between fossils and thunder is not limited to China. Among Native American nations of North America, the great bird of legend called the Thunderbird lived in stories passed from one generation to the next. This bird was said to dwell high above the clouds, a being so immense that its wings spread wide enough to block out the sun. When it flew, the flapping of its wings made the sound of thunder, and when it blinked its eyes, lightning flashed. Its power was both feared and respected, for it could bring storms but also protect people from evil spirits and dangerous creatures. The Thunderbird was not a small gentle bird but a mighty hunter, often shown carrying giant serpents in its claws. In many stories, the Thunderbird waged eternal battle against these serpents, which themselves were tied to rivers, floods, and the underworld. Some scholars believe that when Native American people saw the fossilized bones of pterosaurs, large prehistoric birds, or even mammoths, they may have connected them to the Thunderbird. A curved fossil beak, a long wing bone, or a huge rib might be seen as proof that these sky rulers were real. In places like the Black Hills and the Badlands, where fossils often lie close to the surface, It is easy to see how discoveries of ancient remains could have inspired tales of the Thunderbird. These stories gave meaning to the terrifying sound of storms that rolled over the prairies. They gave a face to thunder and lightning, not as blind forces of nature, but as the cries and movements of a bird that soared higher than any human eye could see. Thunderbirds appeared in ceremonies, dances, and carved images. In the Pacific Northwest, they were carved into totem poles with eyes wide and wings stretched out, guardians of villages who looked down upon the people with a mixture of protection and warning. Across the Great Lakes, stories spoke of their battles with water serpents, each clap of thunder marking another strike in their never-ending war. The sound of a storm was not only frightening but sacred, a sign that the bird above still lived and still watched. If one looks across the world, it is striking how often great bones are linked to dragons and thunder. In Greece, ancient writers spoke of titanic battles between gods and giants, and the discovery of huge bones in caves and cliffs was often taken as proof of those struggles. The Greek word dinosaur did not yet exist, but they spoke of monstrous beings like Typhon and the Gigantes, who shook mountains and threw lightning bolts in their wars against Zeus. In some parts of Europe, the remains of mammoths and mastodons were thought to be those of dragons slain by saints. The church preserved stories of heroes fighting giant reptiles that spat fire, and bones discovered in hills were pointed to as evidence. In Norse lands, thunder was tied to Thor, the god who carried a hammer that cracked the sky with each strike. Though the Norse did not tie their thunder directly to bird fossils, the same idea of giving living form to natural power was at work. A storm was not just air and water, it was the action of a being with strength and will. When bones of strange shapes were found, they could be tied to giants or dragons that Thor had defeated. The way fossils turned into myth can also be seen in Africa. Some stories from the Sahara and other regions spoke of giant serpents that brought storms and floods, creatures whose skeletons could sometimes be found buried in sand or rock. In the deserts of Morocco and Niger, where fossils of long-necked sauropods and fierce carnivores like Spinosaurids rest, people once came across bones larger than anything they knew from living animals. It was only natural to weave them into tales of thunderous monsters, for what else could explain their massive size? In South America, the thunderbird takes on different but related forms. Among the Mapuche of Chile and Argentina, a great bird called the pilan was tied to thunder, lightning, and volcanoes. Just as the thunderbird shook the plains of North America, so the pilan filled the Andes with storms. In Amazonian stories, there are tales of flying serpents and sky creatures that bring the rains. Fossils found along riverbanks, including giant sloths and glyptodonts, may have inspired parts of these stories. The name thunder lizard itself, used in English to describe certain dinosaurs like Brontosaurus, shows how the human mind naturally linked giant bones to storms. Brontosaurus literally means thunder lizard, a name chosen in the 19th century by paleontologists who thought of the ground shaking beneath the steps of such a beast. Though these scientists worked with measurements and theories, they too reached for the language of myth to capture the feeling of awe such bones inspired. Even in medieval Europe, peasants who found fossils often carried them to churches or local wise men who explained them in terms of dragons. Caves where fossils were found became known as dragon caves, and some villages displayed bones in their town halls or cathedrals as relics of slain monsters. These relics drew travellers who wished to see with their own eyes the remains of beings from legends. For many people, to see a huge tooth or jawbone was proof that the old stories were not just words. The use of bones as medicine, as in China, was also known in other lands. Powdered dragon teeth were sold as cures for sickness or as charms against evil. In truth, these were fossil teeth of prehistoric animals, but their size and weight gave them an aura of mystery. If the creature was mighty enough to leave behind such a tooth, then surely its strength remained in the powder. Thunderbirds and dragons also share a bond with water. Many stories tie these creatures not only to the sky, but to rivers, lakes, and seas. In Chinese myth, dragons controlled the rains and lived in rivers and seas. In Native American myth, the thunderbird battled water serpents, beings tied to floods. The clash of thunderbird and serpent could be heard in the sound of thunder, the eternal struggle of sky and water. These stories may have grown stronger when people found bones near rivers, as floods often washed fossils out of their rocky beds. The presence of fossils shaped landscapes of meaning. In Mongolia, where the desert sands sometimes reveal the nests of dinosaur eggs, people long believed that these round stones were the eggs of dragons. a whole stretch of land could become known as a dragon's graveyard. The Gobi Desert, with its wealth of fossils, has given rise to countless tales of beasts long gone but never forgotten in history. In North America too, certain cliffs and ridges became sacred because of the bones they yielded. People walked among them with reverence, knowing that these were the remains of thunder beings. The Spinosaurus has always stood apart from the other giant dinosaurs of the ancient world. When most people think of dinosaurs, their minds turn to the massive long-necked sauropods, the horned and armoured beasts of the Cretaceous plains, or the fierce hunters like the Tyrannosaurus rex. Yet the Spinosaurus, with its strange sail-like structure rising high above its back, seemed almost like a creature pulled out of legend rather than one belonging to the fossil record. It appeared both real and mythical, almost as if the boundary between natural history and ancient storytelling had blurred. To speak of the Spinosaurus is to explore not just bones and teeth, but also mystery, confusion, and shifting discoveries that have kept paleontologists in wonder for more than a century. The story of Spinosaurus begins in the early years of the 20th century. Around the year 1912, a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer travelled to Egypt to explore fossil-rich rocks in the Sahara Desert. This was no easy journey. The desert stretched endlessly with its blistering heat, blowing sands and lonely silence. Yet hidden within its sandstone layers lay treasures from a world millions of years old. Stromer and his team dug into these rocks and pulled out the remains of a creature that defied expectations. What they found included long crocodile-like jaws filled with conical teeth, bones from an unusual skull, and most striking of all, enormous spines that rose up from the animal's back. These spines were not short or stumpy, but long, towering structures that seemed to reach nearly as tall as a grown man. Stromer realized at once that this was not an ordinary predator. He named it Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, meaning spine lizard from Egypt. At the time of its discovery, Stromer could only guess at what the animal looked like. He tried to piece together its form from the bones he had collected. The long, narrow jaws suggested that the creature fed on fish, perhaps living along rivers or lakes rather than chasing after herds of land-dwelling dinosaurs. The tall spines puzzled him most of all. They formed a kind of sail, unlike anything seen before in large carnivorous dinosaurs. Some suggested the sail was used to attract mates, others thought it helped regulate the animal's body temperature, and still others imagined it as a display to intimidate rivals. No matter the explanation, the sail gave Spinosaurus an appearance so strange that it seemed to straddle the line between science and myth. Unfortunately, the original fossils that Stromer brought back to Germany did not survive the passing years. During the Second World War, Munich, where the fossils were stored, was heavily bombed. In 1944, the building that housed Stromer's precious specimens was struck, and the bones of Spinosaurus were destroyed in the flames. What remained were Stromer's notes, photographs, and drawings. For decades, these documents were the only evidence scientists had of this remarkable animal. Without the fossils themselves, much about Spinosaurus remained uncertain, and its reconstruction often relied more on speculation than firm knowledge. Artists painted it in many different ways, sometimes with a short, bulky body and sail rising like a flag, sometimes stretched out with the proportions of a crocodile, and sometimes more like a giant, odd version of Tyrannosaurus. For a long time, Spinosaurus lived more in the imagination than in the fossil halls. Other large theropod dinosaurs, such as Tyrannosaurus rex and Giganotosaurus, dominated the discussions of fearsome predators. They were better known, with skeletons that could be mounted in museums and studied in detail. Spinosaurus remained an enigma, a ghost of the desert, half lost to history. It was almost as if it were a mythological creature hiding behind the veil of time. Only Stromer's lost description kept its memory alive, reminding paleontologists that something truly unusual had once lived along the rivers of North Africa during the Cretaceous period, nearly 100 million years ago. The mystery deepened when scattered remains began to appear in later decades. Fossils found in Morocco hinted that Stromer's creature was not a one-of-a-kind discovery. There were bones that matched the strange spines, teeth that carried the same long and conical form, and jaw fragments that looked crocodilian. Yet these fossils were often incomplete, pulled from quarries by local diggers, sold to collectors, and scattered across the world. Still, each fragment whispered the same story. Spinosaurus was real, and it was unlike anything else. Slowly the pieces began to accumulate, though no complete skeleton revealed itself. One of the great turning points came in the early 21st century. Around the year 2014, new discoveries in Morocco gave paleontologists an opportunity to rebuild the image of Spinosaurus. The fossils uncovered showed a creature longer than Tyrannosaurus rex, possibly stretching more than 50 feet in length. Its body seemed elongated, with short legs and a long tail. Its arms, unlike the tiny limbs of Tyrannosaurus, were strong and capable. Its jaws, filled with conical teeth, looked perfect for catching slippery fish. And above all else, the sail rose like a great crest, supported by spines that could reach more than 6 feet tall. These new reconstructions painted a dinosaur that may have been semi-aquatic, something unheard of among large theropods. Most predatory dinosaurs were landstalkers, running across plains and forests, but Spinosaurus might have slipped into rivers, hunting fish the way modern crocodiles do. Its long tail, newly studied with more complete fossils, showed tall vertebrae forming a paddle-like shape, as if designed for swimming. Its nostrils were placed farther back on its head, perhaps allowing it to breathe while keeping its snout submerged. Its dense bones suggested that it could stay underwater without floating to the surface too quickly. Piece by piece, the Spinosaurus began to take shape not as a land tyrant but as a river monster, a giant fish hunter of the Cretaceous waterways. This idea of a semi-aquatic dinosaur fascinated scientists and the public alike. Dinosaurs had long been seen as masters of the land, while reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs ruled the seas. To have a dinosaur that invaded the waters, swimming after fish with the grace of a crocodile yet the size of a bus, blurred the categories that had seemed so neat before. It was as if the myths of river beasts and dragon-like water creatures had found a root in reality. People could almost see ancient fishermen in some forgotten past catching sight of Spinosaurus and weaving stories of water dragons or river demons that lived alongside them. Yet questions continued to swirl. The sail remained a puzzle. Was it truly for display, flashing its height to rivals or mates? Did it act like a giant heat radiator, absorbing and releasing the desert sun to regulate body temperature? Could it have functioned like a hump, storing fat like a camel's, though supported by bone instead of flesh? Or did it help stabilize the dinosaur while swimming, much like the dorsal fin of a fish or whale? No single answer has satisfied all paleontologists, and the sail still rises like a question mark above the fossil. Even the size and shape of Spinosaurus are still debated. Some reconstructions show it as the longest carnivorous dinosaur ever, stretching beyond 50 feet, even rivaling the blue whale in sheer presence if not mass. Others argue that the fossils used to estimate this size might have belonged to different individuals, perhaps exaggerating the length. The legs too cause arguments. Some models portray Spinosaurus with very short hind limbs, making it awkward on land and suggesting it spent most of its time in water. Others suggest longer legs, allowing it to walk more easily, but still preferring riversides for its hunting grounds. In each version, the creature seems stranger and more dreamlike, as if nature itself could not decide how to shape it. The setting in which Spinosaurus lived adds to its mystery. North Africa during the mid-Cretaceous period was not the endless desert we see today. Instead, it was a lush land of rivers, swamps, and sprawling floodplains. Crocodiles, giant fish, and other reptiles thrived in these waterways. Spinosaurus was not alone. It shared its world with other large predators like Carcharodontosaurus, another enormous theropod that hunted on land. To think of these two giants living side by side is to imagine a world where monsters were real, one prowling the rivers and lakes, the other stalking the dry ground, each as terrifying as the other. Such a setting reads more like a tale from ancient folklore than a page from natural history, yet the rocks of the Sahara preserve its truth. When one reflects on Spinosaurus, the sense of myth returns again and again. Its form is so unusual, so different from what people expect a dinosaur to be, that it feels closer to the creatures drawn on ancient maps: sea serpents, dragons, and beasts with sails upon their backs, than to the traditional image of a roaring land predator. The fact that the first fossils were destroyed, leaving only drawings and descriptions, makes it seem even more ghostly, like a legend lost in the flames of war. The scattered fragments from Morocco, sold and traded like pieces of treasure, add to the aura of mystery, as if seekers must collect clues of a forgotten beast. Each discovery pushes the line between myth and reality, showing that the strangest stories sometimes lie hidden in stone. The name itself, Spinosaurus, has a mythical ring. The spine lizard suggests a creature bristling with power, armoured with giant spines that defy explanation. Children who see pictures of it often think of dragons or monsters from fantasy tales. Its crocodile-like jaws seem more suited to a nightmare creature that haunts riverbanks than to a typical dinosaur. Even scientists sometimes describe it in terms that sound more like folklore than biology. A river dragon, a sail-backed predator, a crocodile on stilts. Its image sparks imagination in a way few other dinosaurs can. The enigma grows greater when we consider how little of Spinosaurus has been found compared to its fame. For more than 100 years since Stromer's discovery, only partial skeletons, scattered bones and fragments of sail spines have been uncovered, and yet from this limited evidence, the dinosaur has become one of the most iconic and mysterious of all. It has appeared in films, books and art, often portrayed as a rival to Tyrannosaurus rex, though the two never met in real life. Its sail, rising like a banner, makes it instantly recognisable even when artists disagree on the rest of its body. The mystery itself seems to be part of its power. Paleontologists continue to search the Sahara for more complete remains. Each expedition carries the hope that somewhere beneath the desert sands lies a skeleton that will reveal Spinosaurus in full, finally settling the questions of its shape, size and habits. Yet the Sahara is vast and difficult. Shifting sands bury fossils, while harsh conditions make digging a struggle. Still, the search goes on, because the promise of solving the Spinosaurus enigma is too great to resist. To uncover this dinosaur fully would be like pulling a myth into the daylight, proving at last what shape the river monster truly took. Even now, debates about Spinosaurus echo through scientific circles. Was it the first dinosaur truly adapted to swimming? Did it walk awkwardly on land or move with surprising grace despite its proportions? Was its sail colourful, striped or patterned, glowing under the Cretaceous sun like a warning flag? Or was it more subdued, serving hidden purposes we have not yet uncovered? These questions breathe life into the fossil, keeping it active in discussions, keeping it alive in the imagination. Few dinosaurs inspire such curiosity, such debate, and such wonder. Feathered giants, those great raptors of prehistory, stood as some of the most striking creatures ever to walk upon the earth. Their bones, scattered and buried by time, have been uncovered in deserts, badlands, and rocky cliffs, and when pieced together they reveal a form that seems at once bird-like and monstrous. Long before anyone could speak of evolution or paleontology, the strange shapes of their skeletons stirred deep fears and wild imaginings. To the ancient eye, the fossilized remains of a raptor with claws like scythes and feathers preserved in stone might easily become the body of a dragon, a fiery creature whose wings beat storms into the air and whose cry echoed like thunder. The raptors were not small or fragile like the birds of today. Some were towering, taller than a man, and their teeth were curved like hooks. They had long tails stiffened with rods of bone, which they used to balance as they ran with deadly speed. Their claws, especially the one enlarged sickle-shaped claw on each foot, were terrible weapons that could slice flesh with ease. Add to this the discovery, in more recent centuries, of preserved impressions of feathers that were not mere decoration but dense layered coverings, and suddenly the image changes. These were not lizards in the common sense, but bird beasts, predators whose outline must have looked eerily familiar, as if a hawk had grown to monstrous size. Now consider the human imagination centuries ago. In villages on the edges of deserts in China, farmers and herdsmen often stumbled upon great bones while digging for water or for salt. These bones were unlike anything they had seen on living animals. The vertebrae were massive, the jaws lined with sharp teeth, and the talons curved so deeply that they looked like cruel tools forged in fire. It would have been natural to think of dragons, for dragons were already woven into their stories. Dragons were thought of as beings that ruled the skies, breathed storms, and even breathed fire. The bones matched the myth, so the myth gained strength from the bones. When a raptor fossil with feathers was unearthed, perhaps its arm bones suggested wings, and the myth of bird-like dragons only grew louder in the telling. The most famous raptor fossils, such as those of the Velociraptor, the Deinonychus, and the larger Utahraptor, all share this mixture of traits. They were both bird-like and reptilian, a blend of features that seemed designed to awaken wonder. When a feathered imprint appears in the stone beside their bones, it is almost impossible not to see the shape of a dragon spreading its wings. Feathers in the ancient world were often connected with fire and with spirit. The phoenix, for example, was a fiery bird reborn from flames, and its feathers were said to glow like embers. So, to find feathers on the skeleton of a predator might have inspired the belief that dragons too were feathered and fiery, their wings blazing as they flew across the skies. Raptors were hunters built for speed and cunning. They worked in packs, or so many scientists now believe, using their sharp senses to track prey across plains and forests. Their eyes were forward-facing, giving them depth perception like the owls and hawks of today. This detail alone may have been enough for someone in the distant past to imagine them not as cold reptiles, but as fiery birds of prey, larger than any eagle, more ruthless than any wolf. The discovery of a fossilized skull with its sharp beak-like snout could have inspired carvings and drawings of dragons with bird faces, not just serpentine muzzles. Across many cultures, dragons are shown with bird-like crests, feathers, or even beaks, as if half remembered from the bones of raptors turned up by accident from the ground. The deserts of Mongolia hold some of the most famous fossil beds where feathered raptors have been uncovered. Velociraptor itself was found in the Gobi Desert, its bones preserved for more than 70 million years. The Gobi has always been a land of sandstorms, fierce winds, and sudden weather, the kind of place where stories of dragons would fit naturally. To a traveller who came upon the long jaws and sickle claws of a raptor fossil, the idea of a dragon buried in the sand would have seemed unquestionable. In fact, when the first velociraptor was found in the early 20th century, its sharp claws immediately gave it a reputation as a fearsome killer. For ancient people, those same claws, dug up without scientific explanation, could only have belonged to some monster of legend. But the picture grows stranger when we add the feathers. Fossils from Liaoning province in northeastern China have revealed extraordinary details. Entire raptors covered in feathers pressed flat against stone, wings outspread as if caught mid-flight. These fossils show that some raptors had wings strong enough to glide, perhaps even to fly short distances. Imagine the impact of such a discovery on an ancient farmer. Here was a predator larger than any bird he'd ever seen, its wings feathered yet clawed, its mouth filled with teeth instead of a beak. In his mind, this could not be an ordinary bird, nor an ordinary beast. It was something beyond both, a dragon, the very image of those fiery creatures said to live among the clouds. Feathers and fire have always been tied together in human stories. Feathers can glow in sunlight, shimmering with colours that shift and change like flames. Some birds, such as peacocks and pheasants, have feathers that look like sparks scattered from a fire. Raptors with such plumage might have been imagined as dragons, who breathed flame not only from their mouths, but from their very bodies, their wings flashing like fire as they rose into the sky. The fiery breath of dragons could have been inspired by the sheen of iridescent feathers glimpsed in ancient times, now merged with the terror of finding monstrous skeletons. Even in Europe, where raptor fossils were less common, dragon myths often carry bird-like details. Some dragons are described as having feathered wings rather than leathery ones, their cries like those of giant eagles. In medieval bestiaries, dragons sometimes have talons and beaks, more like hawks than serpents. These details may not have come only from imagination but from scattered reports of strange bones found in faraway lands, traded along silk routes, carried home as curiosities. A claw from a raptor might be sold as the talon of a dragon. A jawbone with teeth might be set in a temple as proof of a creature of legend. The connection grows clearer when we remember that many raptors were not small. The Utahraptor, for example, was more than twice the size of the Velociraptor, a giant among its kind. It stood tall, with claws as long as daggers, and feathers that may have shimmered with colour. Such a beast, if imagined alive by someone holding its fossil claw, could not have been seen as anything less than a dragon. The ground itself seemed to whisper the old stories, for the bones gave them shape. Legends in Central Asia speak of giant birds of prey, sometimes called simurgs or rocks, that could carry off elephants. These bird dragons may have been fueled by the discovery of fossils of raptors, their wings imagined larger and larger until they could blot out the sun. The fiery aspect of these creatures may have come from the desert heat itself, the way the sun burned the sand and the stones where the fossils were found. Fire and feathers joined in one vision, a vision of bird-like dragons born from bones older than memory. In Native American traditions too, the Thunderbird appears as a giant bird whose wings create storms. It is said to shoot lightning from its eyes and to carry fire in its feathers. Could the chance of finding raptor fossils in the cliffs and badlands of North America have added to these tales? The Dakotas, Montana and Utah are all lands rich with raptor bones, and for peoples who lived close to the land, stumbling upon such fossils could not have been a small event. A talon or a skull weathering out of stone might have been carried back to camp as sacred, proof of a mighty thunder being. And as the stories grew, the Thunderbird and the dragon shared shapes, both fiery, both bird-like, both giant, both feared and revered. The sharp talons of raptors, so much like curved blades, may have seemed designed not only for hunting but for tearing through human defences. A claw alone, detached from the rest of the skeleton, could be mistaken for the weapon of a god or a demon. In some Asian traditions, dragon claws were said to grant power, and in Chinese art dragons are often drawn with 3, 4 or 5 claws, each curved like the talons of a bird of prey. The resemblance to raptor claws is uncanny, as though the art echoed the very fossils lying beneath the soil. When scientists in the 20th century began to study raptors more closely, they too felt something of this ancient awe. The discovery that Velociraptor was feathered shocked the scientific world, because it blurred the boundary between bird and dinosaur. It suggested that dragons of myth may indeed have roots in creatures that once lived. The thought that a predator with feathers, wings, claws and teeth stalked the forests of the Cretaceous brought the legends of fiery bird-like dragons back to life in a new light. The vision of a dragon is not only about bones, but about movement. Raptors were built for speed, for leaping, for pouncing. Their tails balanced them as they struck, their wings perhaps beating for extra lift. Such movements, imagined from the skeleton, could look like the leaps and flights of dragons. Fire, wings, claws, and thunderous power. These were the things people saw when they told stories of dragons. Fossils provided the evidence, even if no one knew what fossils truly were. When feathered raptor fossils first began to appear in Liaoning, some of the most striking showed long feathers on the arms, arranged like wings. They also showed downy coverings across the body, proof that these were not bare-skinned reptiles. To someone without knowledge of prehistory, such a creature would appear as a monster bird, not a dinosaur. And in stories, birds that grow too large become dragons. Fire is the natural element added to explain their power, their size, their fearsome presence. In many ways, feathered raptors were dragons before dragons. They were apex predators with features of both bird and reptile. They had wings but also teeth, feathers but also scales, grace but also terror. When their fossils came to light, they carried with them echoes of all these traits. Human imagination did the rest, filling in the gaps with fire, storms and myth. Across deserts and mountains, across centuries of story, the raptor fossils kept whispering, shaping the fiery bird-like dragons that have lived so long in our legends. The sea has always been a place of both wonder and fear, and across thousands of years people have told stories of monstrous beings rising from its depths. Sailors spoke of enormous serpents, fishermen swore they had seen long-necked creatures sliding across the waves, and whole communities were convinced that the ocean hid powers greater than anything on land. These stories of sea serpents were told in many different lands, from the rocky shores of northern Europe to the islands of the Pacific, from the coasts of Africa to the cold waters around the Americas. Each place had its own version of the tale, yet they all shared something in common, a belief that the ocean was home to gigantic beings unlike anything seen on the surface. While these tales were told as myths or warnings, science later uncovered fossils of huge marine reptiles from the age of dinosaurs, such as the mighty mosasaurs and the long-necked plesiosaurs. These real creatures, though long extinct, may have been at the heart of the legends, giving substance to the mystery of the sea serpent. The mosasaurs were among the greatest predators of the seas during the last part of the Cretaceous period, tens of millions of years ago. They were not fish, and they were not dinosaurs, but marine reptiles related more closely to monitor lizards and snakes. Some mosasaurs reached lengths of more than 50 feet, longer than many boats that ancient people used for travel and fishing. Their bodies were strong and sleek, built for swimming with great power. They had long tails that whipped from side to side like those of modern sharks, giving them speed and agility in the water. Their jaws were filled with sharp, conical teeth that could crush and tear, and some species had an extra set of teeth further back in their throats, allowing them to grip prey and prevent it from escaping once swallowed. These creatures would have hunted fish, turtles, squid-like animals, and even other marine reptiles. If one were seen by a human in ancient times, it would not be hard to understand why they might call it a serpent of the sea. The body stretching long through the water, the head rising with jaws wide open, the tail swishing beneath the waves, all could feed the image of a terrifying monster. The plesiosaurs, on the other hand, looked quite different. They appeared during the earlier part of the Mesozoic era, and lasted through many millions of years until they also vanished in the great extinction event that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Their bodies were broad and flat, almost like a turtle's shell without the hard covering, and they had 4 large flippers that worked like wings in the water, propelling them with grace and precision. Some kinds of plesiosaurs had long, snake-like necks with small heads at the end, while others had short, thick necks and large jaws filled with teeth. The long-necked ones especially remind many people of sea serpent stories, because they could stretch their heads high above the surface, with the rest of the body hidden below the water. To someone watching from a distance, it might look like the body of a giant snake twisting through the ocean. If several of these necks broke the surface in a line, it could even appear as though a many-humped monster was undulating across the waves. Stories of sea serpents go back as far as written history. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were tales of Tiamat, a great dragon of the sea who symbolized chaos. In Norse mythology, there was Jörmungandr, the world serpent, so large that it encircled the earth beneath the oceans. In Greek tradition, there were monsters like Cetus, who was said to rise from the waves to threaten cities and devour maidens. In Japan, fishermen told of long dragons of the sea with flowing whiskers and shimmering scales. On the coasts of North America, some native peoples told of giant water serpents that lived in the lakes and rivers, creatures that demanded respect and sometimes sacrifice. In every case, the monster had traits that could remind one of the great marine reptiles now known through fossils: vast size, serpentine shape, gaping jaws, and the ability to dwell unseen beneath the waters. Fossil discoveries may have played a role in shaping some of these myths. When ancient people stumbled upon the bones of creatures they could not explain, they often gave them meaning by connecting them to stories of gods or monsters. A giant jawbone of a mosasaur, for example, might be mistaken for the skull of a sea dragon. The long neck vertebrae of a plesiosaur could be arranged and interpreted as the remains of a colossal serpent. Even before people understood the age of the earth or the concept of extinct species, they could sense that these bones came from something extraordinary. In China, dragon bones dug from the ground were sometimes ground into powders for medicine. In Europe, fossils were shown in churches as the remains of creatures slain by saints. In the Americas, unusual bones found in the cliffs and plains became part of native traditions about spirit beasts. In all these cases, the presence of real fossils helped give weight to the myths. During the age of exploration, sailors crossing unfamiliar oceans often reported encounters with serpents of the sea. One famous account comes from the 16th century, when Olaus Magnus described in detail a giant sea serpent said to dwell off the coast of Norway. He wrote that it was so large it could circle entire ships, and that it terrified all who saw it. Later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, newspapers printed stories of ships meeting long snake-like creatures in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Witnesses spoke of bodies rising 40, 50, even 100 feet above the waves, with eyes as large as dinner plates and manes like horses flowing along their backs. While skeptics argued these were misidentified whales, giant squids, or even masses of seaweed, others insisted they were glimpses of something far more ancient, perhaps survivors from the age of reptiles. The idea that a plesiosaur or mosasaur could have survived extinction and lingered in the deep seas captured the imagination of many. The mystery was fueled further in the 19th century when the first complete plesiosaur skeletons were unearthed in England. The fossil hunter Mary Anning discovered many important specimens along the cliffs of Lyme Regis, revealing the long necks and strange shapes of these creatures. When scientists reconstructed their appearance, the resemblance to sea serpent stories was striking. Newspapers and books quickly made the connection, suggesting that ancient tales of monsters might have had their roots in these very animals. Some even speculated that not all of them had died out, that perhaps in the cold depths of the ocean they still lived, waiting to surface and show themselves to astonish sailors. The mosasaurs, too, added fuel to the fire of imagination. In the late 18th century, the discovery of a massive skull in a limestone quarry near Maastricht in the Netherlands revealed a predator unlike any known before. With jaws like a crocodile and size surpassing most land creatures, it was soon recognised as a marine reptile. Paintings and engravings spread across Europe, showing the beast thrashing through the water with its mouth open wide. When combined with seafaring tales, it was easy for people to believe that such monsters might still prowl the oceans. The connection between fossil discovery and myth became a cycle. The more fossils were found, the more people believed the old stories had some truth behind them, and the more eager they became to search for living examples. Some of the most famous sea serpent reports came in the waters around New England and Canada during the 19th century. Fishermen and townspeople around Gloucester, Massachusetts, claimed to have seen a serpent over 100 feet long gliding just beneath the surface. So many people reported the sighting that even local authorities organised watch patrols to spot the creature again. Drawings were made showing a long undulating body with several humps rising out of the water, looking very much like a row of plesiosaur necks or a mosasaur's back. Reports also came from the St. Lawrence River, from the coast of British Columbia, and from the seas around Scotland and Ireland. Each story described something large, snake-like, and strange, moving in ways that did not match whales or other known animals. The legend of the Loch Ness monster in Scotland is perhaps the most famous modern continuation of this theme. Since the 1930s, countless people have claimed to see a creature with a long neck and humped back rising from the deep, dark waters of the loch. Photographs, though often blurry or proven hoaxes, have added to the mystery. Many suggested that the Loch Ness monster could be a surviving plesiosaur, trapped in the lake for millions of years. Scientists have pointed out the unlikelihood of such survival, yet the image remains powerful, linking modern folklore directly to the ancient reptiles of the seas. The plesiosaur, with its swan-like neck and powerful flippers, continues to shape the way people think about sea serpents, showing how deeply fossil discoveries have merged with storytelling. In other parts of the world, different sea serpent traditions have also drawn comparisons with marine reptiles. In Japan, there are tales of creatures called umibozu, ghostly beings that rise from the sea to overturn ships, sometimes described with long necks or serpent-like forms. In the Pacific Islands, there are dragon-like spirits of the sea who protect or punish those who travel the waves. In West Africa, the rainbow serpent of the waters is a powerful force connected with fertility and storms. In South America, some tribes told of giant water snakes that could swallow boats whole. All these tales show how the image of the serpent fits naturally with the mystery of the ocean, and how the discovery of real ancient serpent-like animals adds depth to those beliefs. The way marine reptiles looked in life also lends itself well to myth. A mosasaur surfacing suddenly would have shown a huge head with teeth gleaming, eyes staring, and a long back cutting through the water. A plesiosaur stretching its neck would have looked like a snake rising where no snake should be, far from land. Even though these creatures were gone long before humans appeared, their fossils and the way they stir the imagination make it easy to believe they inspired the sea serpent image. The human mind naturally seeks patterns, and when something unexplained is seen, it reaches for the closest match. A whale's back breaking the surface in several places could be seen as a serpent's humps. A giant squid's long tentacles thrashing in the waves could be mistaken for a long neck. But when people already had fossils of giant reptiles at hand, the leap to believing in surviving sea monsters was short and natural. Even today, with advanced science and technology, the allure of sea serpents continues. Expeditions are launched to search for strange creatures in the oceans. Sonar scans sometimes show large moving shapes that cannot be identified. Fishermen bring up carcasses of decayed sharks that look eerily like plesiosaurs, with long bodies and shortened snouts caused by decomposition. Each time such a body washes ashore, it reignites the debate. Is this proof of a living marine reptile or just another trick of nature? Newspapers print the stories, and readers once again connect them to the ancient monsters of the past. The ocean itself adds to the mystery, for it is vast and largely unexplored. Even in the 21st century, humans have seen only a small part of the deep seas. New creatures are discovered every year, some of them large and strange enough to challenge our understanding. Giant squid, once thought to be only myths, were proven real when they were finally filmed alive. Colossal squid, even larger, were hauled up from the depths with eyes as wide as dinner plates. These discoveries show that the ocean can still surprise us, which leaves open the possibility, at least in the human imagination, that something even greater may still swim unseen. In this way, the ancient marine reptiles remain tied to modern mystery. The thought of winged serpents and sky dragons has filled the stories of many ancient people, and one of the most fascinating possibilities behind these myths lies in creatures that truly did exist long ago. These were the flying leviathans of the prehistoric skies, the pterosaurs. Long before the first humans ever walked the earth, millions of years earlier, these enormous flying reptiles ruled the skies. They were not birds, nor were they bats, and they were not even technically dinosaurs, though they lived alongside them. They belonged to their own group, a family of creatures that stretched across a vast range of shapes, sizes, and lifestyles. To those who may have stumbled upon their fossilized bones, or to people who might have found fragments of wings, teeth, or strange skulls protruding from cliffs and deserts, these creatures could have seemed like proof of mighty beings that once soared above the earth. When stories of dragons and flying serpents began to form in human cultures, it is easy to see how such creatures, half real and half legendary, could have played a part in shaping them. The pterosaurs first appeared more than 200 million years ago during the late Triassic period, and survived for tens of millions of years through the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous before finally disappearing about 66 million years ago during the same mass extinction that also destroyed the non-avian dinosaurs. They range from small bird-sized creatures with wingspans shorter than a human arm to massive giants, with wings stretching more than the height of a giraffe. Some of the largest, such as Quetzalcoatlus, could spread their wings to more than 10 meters across. To the ancient mind, a creature with such immense wings would seem far beyond natural explanation, and even though no human ever saw them alive, the traces they left behind in the earth could have inspired tales of dragons with sky-darkening wings. The way pterosaurs looked must have been striking. Many had long, tooth-filled jaws like crocodiles adapted for the air, while others had long crests on their heads, sometimes shaped like spears or sails. These head crests were often larger than the rest of the skull and could be brightly coloured when alive. To see such a skull weathered out of a hillside would have been bewildering, a strange bony ornament that looked as if it had belonged to a monster of fire and air. Their wings were made of skin stretched along an enormously long fourth finger, unlike bird wings that depend on feathers. This made their skeletons appear very different from anything we know today. If a farmer in ancient China or a traveller across the deserts of Central Asia had uncovered one of these bones, he would have no frame of reference except stories of dragons, gods, or demons. Pterosaurs were also diverse in habits. Some lived by coasts, diving after fish with long spear-like jaws. Others hunted inland, snapping at smaller creatures or scavenging along rivers. Their beaks could be needle-like, perfect for catching slippery prey, or blunt and powerful for crushing shells. Their fossilized remains have been found across nearly every continent, meaning they were widespread and not limited to one region. This wide distribution increases the chances that ancient people, from Europe to Africa to the Americas, could have stumbled upon their fossilized remains, each community interpreting the finds in its own cultural language of myths. In China, stories of dragons stretch back thousands of years, describing beings that could twist and rise into the heavens. The word for dragon itself, long, is tied with ideas of power, strength, and luck. In many cases, these dragons are described as having long snake-like bodies, clawed limbs, and the ability to fly through clouds. Now, if someone in early Chinese history had discovered the fossilized skeleton of a pterosaur, with its long jaw, strange claws, and enormous wings, it would be easy to interpret it as belonging to a dragon that once flew the skies. The deserts of northwestern China, such as the Gobi, are rich in fossils, and many bones have weathered out for centuries. Even today, many fossil sites in Asia produce beautifully preserved pterosaur remains. It is possible that these bones once gave physical weight to the idea that dragons were not only possible but real. In Mesoamerica, the great god Quetzalcoatl was represented as a feathered serpent, a being both of the earth and of the heavens, moving like a snake but soaring like a bird. When the remains of giant pterosaurs such as Quetzalcoatlus were later discovered in Texas, paleontologists could not help but notice the resemblance in name and imagery. A flying creature with wings so immense, living in regions close to Mexico, would align eerily well with the concept of a serpent that could take flight. The discovery of its fossil bones in rock layers that eroded naturally may have been noticed by ancient peoples who lived near those regions, long before science gave the bones their modern name. To find the massive beak of such a pterosaur would suggest the head of a serpent bird hybrid, exactly the sort of creature that would inspire reverence and awe. Other cultures too told of winged serpents. The ancient Greeks spoke of the draken, serpentine monsters that could sometimes take to the air, and the ancient Near Eastern myths told of beings like the flying serpent Apophis. Even the Hebrew Bible makes mention of fiery flying serpents in the deserts. Such stories may have been purely symbolic, but they might also have grown from contact with the fossilized bones of creatures whose wings and jaws were beyond anything living humans had ever known. In dry deserts, where bones are often preserved, ancient travelers could easily have stumbled across them, weaving them into their tales of gods, demons, and dragons. The structure of pterosaur wings themselves is something that, when imagined alive, could explain many myths of flying dragons. Unlike birds, which have feathers, or bats, which have membranes supported by several fingers, the pterosaurs had one single extended finger, stretched longer than the rest, holding up the entire wing. This created a vast triangle of skin that could stretch from the tip of the finger to the body and sometimes even to the legs. Such a design would have given them great control in the air, and some species may have soared for hours, gliding on thermals like eagles. To someone trying to explain the sight of a dragon, the notion of wide, leathery wings would fit perfectly, as many myths describe dragons as winged creatures with stretched bat-like membranes. Some pterosaurs had teeth so sharp and numerous that their jaws looked like rows of daggers. The pterosaur Rhamphorhynchus, for instance, had long needle-like teeth that projected outward, making its skull look dangerous even as a fossil. Others, like Pteranodon, had no teeth but had huge beaks and tall crests that would have looked strange and otherworldly. The crests themselves, ranging from small knobs to enormous sails, would have been very confusing to anyone who found them without context. They could easily be mistaken for horns or strange helmets belonging to legendary beasts. The fact that they varied so much in size and shape only added to the mystery. Throughout history, humans have always tried to make sense of the unknown by connecting it to their stories. A fisherman who found the jawbone of a pterosaur weathered out of a cliff might say it came from a dragon slain by a hero. A traveller who stumbled across strange wing bones might tell his village that the skies once held monsters that could swoop down and snatch livestock. Over centuries, these stories would spread, change, and become legends of winged serpents and flying dragons. Even without direct encounters, the presence of fossils alone could fuel myths, because bones were seen as proof. There is also the matter of how pterosaurs moved on the ground. Unlike birds, they walked using both their wings and legs, like giant bats. Fossilized tracks show that they moved on all fours, their long wings folded but still part of their gait. To see such a skeleton might give the impression of a beast equally at home crawling on the earth and soaring in the sky, much like the dragons that legends describe as being able to live in caves or mountains, but rise into the heavens when needed. Their ability to combine qualities of both serpent and bird-like beings fits neatly with the images passed down in folklore. In Europe, medieval bestiaries described dragons as hoarders of treasure that could breathe fire and had wings like leather sails. While the fire-breathing is pure imagination, the leathery wings bear strong similarity to those of pterosaurs. The skulls of some large species, if found without knowledge of what they truly were, could have been displayed as proof of dragon remains. Indeed, many supposed dragon bones kept in European towns during the Middle Ages turned out to be fossils of prehistoric creatures. To the people of those times, such finds confirmed the old legends, making them not just tales but truths grounded in stone. The deserts of Africa too hold pterosaur remains, and across the continent there are tales of winged creatures, sometimes snakes with wings, other times giant birds with serpent-like qualities. In ancient Egypt, winged serpents were spoken of as guardians, and as dangerous beings that could come from the desert. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, even described hearing about flying serpents in Arabia. These beings, he said, were shaped like snakes, but had wings like bats. His description, though likely exaggerated, sounds uncannily similar to the outline of a pterosaur. While Herodotus may never have seen fossils himself, the stories he heard could have been shaped by local discoveries of strange bones in desert cliffs. In South America, cultures told of enormous birds and serpent-like beings that could fly between mountains. Pterosaur fossils have been found in Brazil, many of them beautifully preserved, showing crests and wings that seem otherworldly. The sight of such fossils in ancient times might well have led to myths of flying monsters woven into the spiritual and cultural life of the people. The very fact that the fossils are so striking, with long beaks and head ornaments, would have made them stand out as something extraordinary. The sheer scale of the largest pterosaurs cannot be overstated. A creature like Quetzalcoatlus, standing taller than a giraffe on the ground and spreading wings wider than a small airplane, would be terrifying to witness alive. Its fossil bones alone are massive, with hollow structures built for flight but large enough to impress any finder. To those in the past, such bones would not belong to an ordinary animal. They would seem to confirm the existence of a flying dragon, something larger than life and part of the heavens themselves. Even smaller pterosaurs could have inspired awe. Some were covered with a fuzzy coat of picon fibers, giving them a strange, hairy or feathery appearance. To imagine such a creature flapping above the earth with leathery wings and a furry body, snapping fish from rivers, would certainly give rise to myths of fiery, feathered or scaled beings that defy easy description. The fact that they blurred the line between reptile, bird and mammal could easily translate into legends of hybrid beasts, serpents with wings, dragons with feathers, or sky demons. The fossil record also suggests that pterosaurs were not simple flyers, but complex and varied. Some may have flown across oceans, gliding on air currents for great distances. Others may have nested on cliffs in colonies, filling the skies with thousands of beating wings. Such images, if ever glimpsed by early humans in fossil evidence, would have become tales of armies of dragons or swarms of flying serpents blotting out the sun. The scale of the fossil beds alone, with many individuals preserved together, could give the impression of legendary battles or dragon gatherings. The link between pterosaurs and winged serpent myths may never be proven, but the similarities are striking. From long snake-like necks and bodies, to vast leathery wings, to head crests that look like horns, many of the features of these real flying leviathans echo the descriptions of dragons and flying serpents across the world. Whether in the deserts of Arabia, the mountains of China, the jungles of Mesoamerica, or the plains of Europe, people told stories of creatures that ruled the skies with power and mystery. And beneath their feet, locked in stone, lay the real bones of beings that once did just that. When people long ago thought about creatures with horns, they often pictured animals that looked both familiar and strange, half born from the world they knew and half brought from a place of wonder. The earth has always held bones beneath its soil, bones that no living person had ever seen before, and sometimes these ancient remains sparked ideas that led to myths. Among these hidden bones were those of mighty dinosaurs, and one of the most striking among them was the Triceratops, a creature that lived in the late Cretaceous age, tens of millions of years before the first humans ever walked the earth. This animal carried a crown of horns upon its head, and a great bony shield spread behind its skull. To see such bones uncovered without knowing their true origin could easily stir the belief in monsters, perhaps even in unicorn-like beings, for the horns of the Triceratops held a shape that reminded people of legendary horned beasts. The Triceratops was not small. It stretched longer than a horse-drawn wagon and weighed more than several elephants together. Its skull was one of the largest of any land animal that ever lived, nearly as long as a man is tall, and upon this skull sat 3 horns. 2 were long, curving weapons above the eyes, pointing forward like spears, and one was shorter, rising from the nose like a dagger. To eyes untrained in the study of fossils, a single horn detached from its skull might look like the remains of a one-horned beast, just as the old legends described. Imagine a farmer in ancient times, digging his land and striking stone, only to pull forth a long, tapering horn that seemed too large to belong to any goat, bull or deer he had ever seen. Such a discovery could turn into a story that outlived him, a story of a unicorn or of a monster that once roamed the valleys and forests. The unicorn as a creature of myth is not tied to one culture alone. It appeared in stories from Europe, from India, from China, and from other corners of the earth. Sometimes the unicorn was told as a gentle creature, pure and shy, a beast that could be tamed only by the innocence of a young maiden. In other tales, it was a ferocious animal, dangerous to hunt, with a horn that could pierce armor. The horn itself was thought to hold great powers. In medieval times in Europe, pieces of what was believed to be unicorn horn were sold as treasures that could protect from poison, heal sickness, and guard against evil. Most of those horns were in truth the long tusks of the narwhal, a whale that swims in the icy seas, but the belief was real. Yet behind all these stories there might also have been a shadow cast by much older creatures, like the Triceratops, whose horns had been turned to stone in the earth long before humans began to tell stories. If a fossil horn was ever unearthed and not understood, it would easily be drawn into the net of myth. The land where Triceratops lived was a place of wide plains, with rivers and forests scattered across it. This was the closing chapter of the age of dinosaurs, just before the great asteroid strike that ended their reign. Herds of Triceratops may have moved together across the land, grazing on tough plants with their beak-shaped mouths. They faced dangers from predators like Tyrannosaurus, the great king of reptiles, who would have been both hunter and rival. The horns and shield of Triceratops were not for decoration alone. They were weapons and defences used in life-or-death struggles. Fossils of Triceratops skulls sometimes show marks and punctures that match the bite of Tyrannosaurus teeth, showing battles fought long ago. In other cases, the horns of Triceratops show wounds that might have come from fighting one another, perhaps in contests for mates or to defend their place in the herd. The sight of such a creature in life would have been something that no story could fully capture. Yet when their bones were found long after, those bones became fuel for stories about horned beasts, dragons, and unicorn-like monsters. Even in times closer to us, when science was not yet ready to explain dinosaurs, strange bones were discovered and often misunderstood. In China, ancient bones were ground into powders and used in medicine. People called them dragon bones. Large skulls with horns could have been seen as proof that dragons, unicorns, or killin had once walked the land. In Europe, fossilized bones were sometimes thought to be the remains of giants, or mythical beasts described in the Bible. The unicorn, which had been mentioned in old scriptures, found support in these misinterpreted remains. To hold in one's hand a piece of horn that seemed turned to stone must have been a deeply stirring experience, convincing enough to strengthen belief in beasts that no living person had ever seen. The single-horned beast has long fascinated human thought. In Mesopotamia, ancient carving showed bulls and goats with exaggerated horns, and sometimes the art depicted creatures with only one horn visible, which may have inspired tales of one-horned animals. In India, the old text spoke of a one-horned rhinoceros, which still lives today in the marshes and forests, carrying a single thick horn on its nose. In Greece, travellers' stories reached the people, describing animals in far-off lands that seemed like unicorns. By the time of the Middle Ages, the unicorn had become a symbol of purity and strength, drawn in tapestries and painted on shields. All the while, fossil bones slept beneath the soil, waiting for a chance to add their silent voices to the stories. The horns of Triceratops were not like the horns of deer or cattle, which are made of bone or keratin that can fall away or grow back. These were solid bones, part of the skull itself, rooted deeply into the head. When fossilized, they looked like great spears, smooth and heavy. A single horn taken from its skull might look like a unicorn horn more than any other animal part. To someone in the past who had never seen a rhinoceros, and who only heard stories of magical beasts, such a fossil horn could seem like proof. Even today, when one looks at the fossil skull of a Triceratops, it carries an aura of something almost myth-like, as though nature itself had shaped a creature that seemed too perfectly designed for legend. The Triceratops was not alone in wearing horns among the dinosaurs. Many of its relatives, called ceratopsians, carried horns and frills of all shapes and sizes. Some had long horns above their eyes, others had curled horns or shorter ones, and still others carried tall frills decorated with spikes. One species, Stegosaurus, wore a crown of long spikes spreading from its neck like a sunburst, looking even more fearsome than the Triceratops. To stumble upon the fossil remains of such a creature without knowing about dinosaurs would have been to meet a monster in the earth. Horned monsters appear in many myths, from bulls with fiery breath to dragons with spiked heads. The line between fossil reality and mythical imagination was thin and easily crossed. In the plains of North America, where Triceratops bones have been found in great numbers, native peoples sometimes discovered fossils long before modern science. To them, the bones could be part of spiritual understanding, perhaps linked to the great Thunderbird or to creatures of the underworld. A horn or skull unearthed might be seen as a gift or a warning. Though we cannot know exactly what stories were told from these discoveries, the bones were there, and they surely played a part in shaping the sense of the land's mystery. Just as people in Europe and Asia connected strange bones with dragons or unicorns, so too could the great fossilized horns of Triceratops have whispered tales of beasts unlike any that lived in their time. The unicorn myth carried with it a sense of longing, as though people wished for a creature that could not exist, a being that bridged the line between the earthly and the divine. The horn was said to be able to heal, to bring life, to cleanse poisoned water, to shield against curses. These beliefs gave the horn a sacred weight. Fossil horns, heavy and enduring, seemed to hold that same sacredness. A stone horn taken from the earth would not rot or decay. It would last beyond generations, almost immortal. To see such an object must have felt like touching eternity, and the myth of the unicorn grew stronger with every such relic found. In medieval Europe, unicorn horns, or what were believed to be unicorn horns, were guarded as priceless treasures by kings and churches. They were displayed as proof of divine mysteries. Yet behind these displays, one can picture the older story of a farmer or shepherd stumbling across a horn-shaped fossil, carrying it home, and passing it from hand to hand until it became part of greater myths. The Triceratops, though never seen alive by humans, might have been speaking softly through its bones, feeding the human hunger for stories of horned beasts. The strength of the horn in myth often stood for the strength of the creature itself. The one-horned monster was seen as powerful because its single horn was perfect, pure, unbroken by pairs. It was something unique. Yet the Triceratops held 3 horns, a trinity upon its head, and that too could be seen as carrying a symbolic weight. In some myths, there was a number of power, of balance, of unity. The skull of Triceratops, with its shield and 3 horns, could look to a mythmaker like a crown forged by nature. Even if one of those horns was found alone, separated by time and burial, it could serve as the seed of a story about a horned monster unlike any other. The landscapes where Triceratops bones rest today stretch across places like Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. These lands have been rich in fossils, and since the 19th century scientists have uncovered many skulls and skeletons there. But long before the trained scientists came, storms and rivers were exposing fossils, laying them bare for anyone who wandered nearby. A person in ancient times who stumbled upon a horn rising from a cliffside might have seen it as a creature trapped in stone, a monster still waiting to rise. The sight would have been enough to create legends passed on for generations. The unicorn, the horned dragon, the monstrous bull, all could trace some threads back to those fossils lying in silence for millions of years. The Triceratops itself had many species, each with slight differences in the shape of horns and frills. Some had longer brow horns, others shorter nose horns. These differences meant that a variety of horn shapes could be found as fossils. Each horn was like a different kind of relic, some slender and sharp, others thick and curved. This variety might explain why myths of horned beasts also came in many forms. Some cultures spoke of gentle unicorns, others of raging monsters, still others of divine messengers shaped like bulls with shining horns. The earth gave different horns, and people gave different stories to match them. When the first true fossils of Triceratops were studied by scientists in the late 19th century, they were astonished by the size and shape of the animal. The name itself means 3-horned face, chosen because the skull was so dominated by its horns. But even then, in the time of science, some people saw the connection to myth. Newspaper articles and books compared the Triceratops to dragons, to monsters of legend, to horned beasts that might have inspired the unicorn. The link between fossils and myth was not lost, even when science provided a clear explanation. It showed that the power of horned beasts in the human imagination was not something easily dismissed. The horns of Triceratops were not only bones, they were weapons grown by nature, shaped by evolution over millions of years. To a human hand, a fossil horn is cold and heavy, but in life, it was alive, full of blood and strength, able to pierce flesh and defend its bearer. To think of such a weapon turned to stone and hidden in the earth is to think of time itself turned solid. Perhaps it was this feeling that made people ascribe magical powers to horns, whether unicorn or otherwise. A horn was not just a part of a body, it was a symbol of survival, of battle, of victory. A fossil horn carried all those meanings, and myths grew around them as naturally as grass grows around stone. The one-horned monster also lived in stories of the wilderness. In forests and deserts, people said such beasts roamed, hard to find, hard to tame. The Triceratops, if seen in life, would have fit perfectly into such a story. Large, armoured, with horns sharp and dangerous, it was both beast and legend. Though no human ever saw it alive, its bones gave enough shape to the imagination to fill that gap. The horned beast of legend was not only a creature of the mind, but also a shadow cast by the real animals of deep time. The unicorn and the Triceratops, though separated by millions of years, met within the human imagination. Armoured titans are among the most fascinating creatures to ever walk the earth, for their bodies carried the kind of defences that seem more fitting for creatures of myth than for real animals that once roamed forests, plains and valleys. The names Ankylosaur and Stegosaur are often spoken in the same breath because both carried protective structures across their backs, though they were very different in design. One carried great plates rising like sails, while the other wore heavy bone armour, almost like a moving fortress. Their appearances were so unusual and so dramatic that it is easy to think of them as the living image of beasts from legends and battle songs, the sort of animals that ancient storytellers might have imagined fighting in wars of gods and heroes. In myths from every part of the world, there are tales of beasts covered in shields or bristling with spikes, and when one studies the fossils of Ankylosaurs and Stegosaurs, the connection between reality and imagination feels even stronger. Ankylosaurs are often compared to tanks. Their skulls were broad and low, their bodies squat and wide, and their backs were paved with bony plates known as osteoderms. These were not thin scales like those of a lizard, but thick, heavy pieces of bone grown within the skin itself, creating a natural armour. Running down their backs, across their sides, even guarding their eyelids, this armour turned them into living fortresses. To top it all off, some of them carried a heavy club at the end of their tails, a brutal weapon of solid bone that could swing with crushing force. The ankylosaur is often imagined squaring off against predators like tyrannosaurs, and one can picture the clash as a battle between a monster with teeth and a monster with armour, much like the way warriors in stories are shown fighting with sword and shield. The Stegosaur, by contrast, looked very different but no less fantastical. Its body was long and heavy, with small forelimbs and tall hind limbs, giving it a sloped back. Along the spine rose great plates of bone, thin but tall, arranged in two staggered rows that gave it a jagged outline, almost like the spine of a dragon or a creature forged in battle legends. At the end of its tail grew long spikes, sometimes 4 of them, sometimes more, arranged like lances pointing backward. Paleontologists call this weapon the thagomizer, a name meant in humour but one that captures its deadly purpose. To an ancient eye, a stegosaur might have seemed like a warbeast carrying banners and spears into combat, a living tower of defences bristling with weapons on both ends. The presence of these extraordinary defences raises questions about how they might have shaped myths. When ancient people stumbled upon large bones weathering from the earth, they may have guessed that they belonged to the kinds of creatures spoken of in legends, mighty warbeasts sent by gods or demons. A fossilised stegosaur plate, flat, curved and tall, could be mistaken for the shield of a giant. The tail spikes, discovered without the rest of the skeleton, could be thought of as the weapons of warriors long ago. In the case of ankylosaurs, the great tail club could look like the hammer of a mythic hero or the mace of a king. All across the world, people have tales of creatures that fight battles for lords and gods, carrying armour on their backs and striking with horns or tails, and the armoured dinosaurs fit those images with startling closeness. In many cultures, there are stories of great beasts covered with armour like scales or shields. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were tales of Tiamat, a monstrous dragon covered with scales, who fought the storm god Marduk. In Greek stories, heroes often fought monsters whose bodies were protected against ordinary weapons, forcing the hero to find clever tricks or enchanted tools. In Indian stories, there were elephants armoured in battle, draped in steel plates and carrying towers on their backs, like living fortresses on the march. When one thinks of these armoured war animals, it is not difficult to compare them to ankylosaurs trudging forward with their plates and clubs, or stegosaurs with their spines and spears. Even real human history saw animals turned into war beasts. Elephants in India, Persia, and later Carthage and Rome were fitted with armour and weapons, sent charging into battle to crush enemies underfoot. Horses too were fitted with barding, steel plates that shielded their bodies so they could carry knights into the clash of swords and arrows. These war animals of history blur into the realm of legend, because in their time they were as fearsome as any dragon or giant. When placed alongside the vision of ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, the comparison becomes even stronger, for nature itself had already created war beasts long before humans imagined or crafted them. The ankylosaur in particular feels like a perfect natural version of an armoured knight or elephant. Its head was broad, its body short and heavy, and its armour thick enough to resist the bite of giant predators. Even its eyelids were protected by small plates, giving it the look of a warrior peering out from a helmet. And then there is the tail club, which could weigh dozens of kilograms, built of fused bone wrapped in muscle, swinging like the mace of a giant. Tests done on models suggest that a blow from such a tail could break the legs of a predator, crippling it in an instant. To a human who might have unearthed the club fossil thousands of years later, it would not be hard to believe it belonged to some ancient champion, or to a beast raised for war by forgotten gods. The Stegosaur, while less heavily armoured, carried an appearance that was even stranger. Its plates, rising high from the back, gave it a form that would have inspired awe or fear. Some have suggested the plates were used for display, flushing with blood to create bright colours when threatened or to attract mates. If that were true, then the animal would have been even more striking in life, with a row of red or orange sails rising along its spine. Combined with the spears of its tail, it would have looked like a bannered war beast, a living symbol of power. In myths, one often hears of creatures that are both beautiful and deadly, their colours glowing, their bodies gleaming with armour, their tails tipped with weapons. The Stegosaur fits that image so well that one wonders if tales of spined or plated monsters across cultures were seeded by the discovery of such fossils. The time in which these animals lived also adds to their mythical aura. Stegosaurs flourished during the late Jurassic period, around 150 million years ago, while ankylosaurs rose to prominence later, in the Cretaceous period, closer to 70 or 66 million years ago. Though separated by tens of millions of years, both carried armour as though nature kept reinventing the war beast again and again. In stories, gods often forge beasts again for new battles, shaping them in different forms but with the same purpose. One can see the echo of this in the way nature created stegosaurs first, with their banners and spears, and later ankylosaurs, with their shields and hammers. When thinking of mythical beasts, one often imagines clashes. Dragons battle heroes, giants battle gods, elephants battle armies, and armoured titans battle predators. One can almost see a scene where a tyrannosaur approaches an ankylosaur, teeth bared, while the ankylosaur lowers its body and swings its club. The strike connects, bones shatter, and the predator reels back. To a storyteller of the old, such a clash would have been described in the same words as a knight striking an enemy with a mace, or a god striking a demon with thunder. Similarly, a stegosaur facing a predator might swing its tail spikes with force enough to pierce flesh and bone. Fossil evidence even shows that predators like allosaurs bore wounds that match the shape of stegosaur tail spikes, proof that these weapons were not just for show. To ancient eyes that might have seen such bones, the idea of a monster striking with spears would not have been a fantasy, but a logical story to explain what they saw. One of the most haunting thoughts is how these animals moved in groups. Some stegosaurs may have lived in herds, their rows of plates flashing in unison like banners on a battlefield. Herds of ankylosaurs, heavy and bristling with armour, might have looked like armies of walking fortresses. Legends often speak of armies of beasts summoned by gods or kings to march against foes. If ancient people found fields of bones, they might have imagined that they were seeing the remains of such mythic armies, long turned to stone. The myths of armoured beasts are not limited to any single culture. In northern European stories, there are dragons with scales that no sword could pierce. In Chinese tales, there are dragons with armoured hides that glisten like shields. In African and Middle Eastern traditions, there are monstrous serpents and lizards clad in tough hides, immune to weapons of men. Each of these echoes the vision of ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, real animals that nature had clothed in armour. The similarities between myth and fossil suggest that the boundary between imagination and reality was thinner than one might think. When soldiers of history rode into war with armoured elephants, when knights charged with armoured horses, when myths described beasts covered in scales and plates, All of these can be tied to the ancient precedent set by dinosaurs that bore their armor millions of years before humanity ever dreamed of battle. Out of a mix of wonder and fear, the idea of an earthquake beast could take form, a land-shaking monster with a roar like thunder and a step that cracked the ground. It is here that we can begin to see how the real giants of the ancient world, the sauropods, may have given rise to such stories. Sauropods were the titans of the dinosaur age. They were the long-necked, long-tailed giants whose size still staggers the imagination today. Creatures like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus and Argentinosaurus stretched their necks high into the treetops or dragged them across wide plains, feeding on endless amounts of plants. Some of them reached lengths of more than 100 feet and weights greater than 70 or 80 tons. Their bones were larger than tree trunks, their footsteps pressed deeper into mud than any living animal today, and their presence must have been like that of living mountains. When the world trembled in an earthquake, when cliffs collapsed, or when storms tore across the land, ancient people may have remembered such fossils and thought of creatures large enough to cause the earth itself to shake. The ground-shaking idea is not far-fetched when you consider how sauropods lived. These giants moved in herds, and a herd of dozens, perhaps even hundreds of such beasts crossing a plain would have been a sight of unmatched scale. Each footfall could leave a crater-like print. Even today, we have fossilized trackways where long lines of sauropod footprints stretch for miles. Standing near them, one feels how heavy the animals must have been. If so many moved together, the vibration might have been felt in the earth itself. To humans who later uncovered the immense bones, the thought of land-shaking monsters would have felt like the only possible explanation. After all, what else could explain bones so massive and strange? The fossils of sauropods are often found in dramatic ways. In cliffsides, entire leg bones taller than a man have been unearthed. Skulls the length of a table and vertebrae heavier than an ox have been carried out of stone. In many places, these discoveries happened long before paleontology existed. Ancient cultures stumbled across them while digging for stone or farming their fields. To people in Greece, in China, in South America, and in many other lands, these bones could only belong to monsters. Chinese records spoke of dragon bones ground up for medicine. Greek tales told of giants buried by the gods beneath the earth. In South America, native peoples told stories of land beasts so heavy their passing shook the mountains. These myths find an echo in the reality of the sauropods. Think of a creature like Argentinosaurus. This massive sauropod, known from South America, is estimated to have reached over 100 feet long and weighed as much as 100 tons. Even though only parts of its skeleton have been found, paleontologists can tell it was one of the largest land animals of all time. If ancient people stumbled upon its fossilized bones, they would have found vertebrae the size of furniture, ribs longer than a person, and leg bones that could hardly be lifted by a team of strong men. The sheer scale of such bones could have created legends of beasts so huge that their mere steps caused the ground to rumble. To a mind without modern science, such an explanation would have made sense. The way sauropods lived and moved also plays into the image of an earthquake beast. These animals had massive pillar-like legs, built to carry extraordinary weight. Each step must have struck the ground with a low, deep force. Some scientists suggest that herds of sauropods moving together may even have produced low-frequency sounds or vibrations that carried across the ground. This is not unlike the way elephants today produce infrasonic rumbles, vibrations too low for human ears, but powerful enough to travel long distances through the earth. In the ancient imagination, such ground-borne tremors could be interpreted as the presence of enormous creatures. To feel the earth vibrate and to see no cause would invite the thought of a hidden monster, perhaps one buried below, waiting to rise again. Earthquakes themselves would have strengthened the association. When the ground split and trembled, ancient people naturally sought reasons. In many mythologies, the cause of earthquakes is explained by beasts. In Japan, the myth speaks of the giant catfish Namazu, thrashing under the earth. In India, the world is said to rest on the back of elephants or a turtle, and when they move, the earth shakes. In South America, some cultures told of great serpents underground whose writhing caused the tremors. If people also discovered bones of creatures too large to be anything ordinary, it was natural to connect the two ideas. Perhaps, they thought, these were the bones of the very monsters who caused the quakes. The roar of the earthquake beast might also be linked to thunder. Sauropods, with their enormous size, could be imagined to have voices louder than any living creature. The long necks and air sacs of these dinosaurs may have allowed them to produce deep, resonant calls. While we cannot know exactly how they sounded, we can imagine their voices carrying for miles like rolling thunder. To people who heard storms crashing over mountains and felt the ground shake beneath them, the two sensations could blend together into the thought of a beast whose roar was thunder itself and whose step was an earthquake. Even the shape of sauropods could inspire fear and awe. Their long necks snaked across the land, their tails stretched like whips behind them, and their bodies towered above trees. A herd of them moving together would have looked like a moving forest. For someone glimpsing such a scene, it would be easy to describe the beasts as shaking the very earth. Fossil trackways sometimes show lines of sauropods walking together, side by side, stretching across the ancient mud. These tracks could fossilize into hardened stone, and then, millions of years later, people might find them as mysterious giant footprints. Standing in one of these footprints today, you could fit several human steps within it. Ancient people, finding such impressions, would have seen proof of monsters far larger than anything alive. It is only natural that they might call them earthquake beasts. The discovery of sauropod bones across the world fed into different traditions. In Greece, where huge bones were found, myths arose of giants who fought against the gods. In China, the bones of enormous prehistoric creatures were taken as proof of dragons. In North America, indigenous peoples told of thunderbirds and ground beasts of immense size. In South America, where the fossils of some of the largest sauropods have been found, stories spread of giant earth creatures whose steps shook valleys. While the names and details differ, the idea is the same. The earth is not empty but full of powerful beings whose might can cause the very ground to quake. The physical reality of sauropods supports this idea. Their skeletons show adaptations for supporting massive weight. Their bones were filled with air sacs to make them lighter, yet they were still incredibly strong. Their legs were like pillars, and their feet were wide, designed to spread out the load. When such an animal moved, it must have pressed the earth with great force. A herd moving in unison would have been like a natural earthquake. If ancient people had any inkling of this through fossils, tremors, or even the preserved tracks, the link between sauropods and earthquake beasts becomes even clearer. The tales of sauropods may also have contributed to the legend. Some paleontologists believe that the long, whip-like tails of certain sauropods, such as Diplodocus, could be snapped like giant whips, even breaking the sound barrier with a cracking noise. If so, these beasts could have produced thunder-like sounds with their tails. To ancient people, this would have only reinforced the idea of monsters whose movements and voices shook the earth. Even without hearing the real sound, finding the skeleton of such a tail could inspire the thought of a weapon capable of cracking mountains. Floods and landslides may also have played a role. In many places where sauropod fossils are found, they were preserved in massive floodplains or riverbeds. Sometimes whole groups of them died together in a catastrophic event. When the bones later eroded from hillsides, they would appear in clusters, as if an army of giants had been buried at once. To people encountering such sights, the story practically told itself. Beasts so mighty that they shook the earth once roamed here, and the gods, or the earth itself, swallowed them beneath the ground. The sheer mystery of fossils cannot be overstated. To a farmer finding a giant femur while tilling the soil, the bone was not just a curiosity, it was proof that something vast had once lived. To priests, shamans, or storytellers, it was a piece of a greater narrative, one that explained why the ground sometimes quaked or why storms thundered. They would weave the bone into myths, turning sauropods into legendary beasts whose roars and footsteps still echoed in the trembling earth. The idea of earthquake beasts also fits with humanity's deep memory of natural disasters. Earthquakes are among the most terrifying natural events, because they come without warning, shaking the ground underfoot, tearing down houses and splitting the earth. To explain such a force, people turned to creatures larger and more powerful than anything they knew. A sauropod, reconstructed in their minds from massive bones and tracks, was the perfect candidate. Its size alone spoke of a being capable of moving mountains. Its imagined roar was thunder. Its imagined step was a quake. Its imagined breath was the wind of storms. Even in modern times, when paleontology gives us scientific explanations, the mythic image lingers. Standing before the skeleton of a brachiosaurus in a museum, towering higher than a house, one feels a kind of awe, not unlike fear. It is easy to think of the earth trembling beneath such a giant, our ancestors, without the benefit of science, felt the same but expressed it through myth. For them, the sauropods became earthquake beasts, monsters whose very presence reshaped the land. There are places where fossilized trackways stretch for miles, as in Texas and Argentina, where sauropod herds once walked. These trackways are not only scientific treasures, but also echoes of myth. They are the footprints of earthquake beasts preserved in stone. To walk among them today is to step into the ancient imagination, where giants shook the earth and left their mark for eternity. The connection between sauropods and myths of land-shaking creatures also shows how people everywhere tried to understand the world through stories. Whether in Japan, India, Greece, or South America, the pattern is similar. The ground shakes, the people fear, they find giant bones and they tell tales of beasts. The details differ, but the idea remains. Enormous creatures hidden beneath or long vanished are the cause of earthquakes. And among all possible creatures, none fits the image better than the sauropods. The vision of an earthquake beast is not only about fear, but also about respect. Such myths gave shape to the power of nature. They reminded people of forces beyond human control, forces that could shake the earth itself. Sauropods, though long gone, provided the bones and the footprints that kept these myths alive. Their reality blurred into legend, their size turned into story, and their memory lived on as the roar of the earthquake beast. The stories would not have been told lightly. When people gathered around fires at night, they shared tales of monsters beneath the ground, of roars like thunder, of steps like quakes. Children listened wide-eyed, and adults nodded, remembering the tremors they had felt and the giant bones they had seen. Each earthquake would renew the tale, each fossil discovery would strengthen it. The sauropods lived on, not only in stone but also in story. When we look at the fossils today, we see them as scientific evidence. But long ago they were signs and omens, pieces of a larger mystery. The earthquake beast was a way of connecting the unknown past with the terrifying present, of explaining why the ground itself could not always be trusted. Sauropods, in their immense silence, became voices in the myths, shaking the earth even after death. The roar of the earthquake beast was not just sound, but sensation. The rolling of thunder, the cracking of whips, the trembling of ground, the crash of trees, and the rush of storms. To the ancient mind, these were all parts of the same phenomenon, all signs of a beast too great to be seen, yet too powerful to be denied. And though the real sauropods vanished millions of years ago, their shadows remained in the tales, in the bones unearthed by farmers, in the footprints preserved in stone, and in the trembling earth that always reminded humanity of forces greater than itself. The tale of the fire breather has echoed across continents and centuries, showing up in stories told around campfires, carved into temple walls, and written into ancient texts. The idea of a creature that can breathe fire seems so strange, so terrifying, and yet so captivating that it has never faded away. The question that has followed such legends is how such an unusual idea could have taken root in the minds of people who had never seen a real dragon. Some point toward the strange bones of giant beasts uncovered by early people, bones that once belonged to creatures that walked the earth millions of years before the first human appeared. Others point toward the power of the land itself, especially the violent and fiery landscapes created by volcanoes, which seem to make the earth itself a living creature capable of belching fire, ash, and smoke. When these two elements are woven together, they offer a picture of how the myth of fire-spitting dragons could have taken shape, born from both the skeletons of dinosaurs and the roar of volcanic landscapes. In many parts of the world where volcanic activity shaped the land, people would have lived with constant reminders of fire and destruction beneath their feet. Lava could rush down the slopes of mountains, scorching the land and swallowing whole villages. Ash could turn daylight into darkness, choking the air and filling the skies with an orange and red glow. Great explosions could shatter the silence of night, making the ground rumble like the heartbeat of some enormous beast hidden within the earth. To early people, who did not yet understand the science of volcanoes, these fiery mountains could not simply be piles of rock and molten stone. They must have seemed alive, like monsters that slept beneath the earth and occasionally awoke with fury. The fire that poured from their mouths was not unlike the fiery breath described in dragon legends. Now consider how the discovery of huge bones might have added to this belief. Fossils of dinosaurs have been found in many parts of the world, sometimes close to regions shaped by volcanic landscapes. A giant skull with sharp teeth, a ribcage taller than a man, a backbone stretching longer than a village street. All of these would have been shocking finds for people with no knowledge of ancient prehistory. To them, such remains would not have belonged to ordinary animals. They would have appeared as the skeletons of monsters, beasts unlike anything alive in their time. And if the land itself was known to spit fire, it would have seemed natural to link the two together. The bones must have belonged to the creatures that lived inside the fiery mountains, and those creatures must have been dragons, capable of breathing fire just like the volcanoes did. In Europe, where dragon tales became deeply rooted in folklore, volcanic activity was less widespread than in places like the Pacific or the Mediterranean. Yet the stories of dragons breathing fire still spread, and this may be explained by trade, travel, and stories carried from volcanic lands. For instance, ancient travellers from Greece and Rome often visited areas with volcanic activity, such as Mount Etna in Sicily or Mount Vesuvius in Italy. Both mountains were feared and respected, their eruptions described in terms that made them seem like living beasts. Mount Etna especially was tied to myths of fire-spitting monsters. Greek poets wrote of the giant Typhon, a monster trapped beneath the mountain, whose fiery breath and writhing movements caused the eruptions. From such descriptions, it is easy to see how later people could imagine dragons as smaller versions of the same fiery beasts, wandering the land and breathing fire. In China, where dragon myths took a different form, the creatures were not always described as fire-breathers, yet in some tales they could control elements of nature, including storms, thunder, and sometimes fire. China is a land rich in fossils, where many dinosaur remains have been uncovered over centuries. Farmers digging the land would sometimes come across bones so large that they seemed to belong to gods or demons. These finds were often collected and even ground into powders for medicine, called dragon bones. It is possible that in regions where volcanic activity also existed, the mix of strange bones and fiery landscapes created new versions of dragon myths, some in which the creatures gained the power to breathe fire. The combination of bones that belonged to ancient giants and the fiery forces of the earth made the dragon both a creature of the past and a living spirit of the land. There are also stories from the Pacific, a part of the world known for its many volcanoes, that link fiery landscapes to monsters. In Hawaii, for example, the goddess Pele was believed to live inside the volcanoes, her anger causing eruptions that poured rivers of lava across the land. People respected her power and told stories of her fiery temper. If we think of how such stories might have mixed with the discovery of ancient bones, it is not hard to imagine how people could create myths of creatures that both lived in volcanoes and breathed fire. The fire-breathing dragon may, in part, be a blending of natural disaster and fossil discovery, both of which were terrifying and mysterious to ancient people. The power of fire itself has always been both feared and admired. To control fire was to control survival, warmth, cooking, and protection from wild animals. But uncontrolled fire was a destroyer, burning forests, villages, and fields. A creature that could produce fire at will would have been the ultimate symbol of both destruction and power. Legends of fire-breathing dragons gave shape to this idea, turning fire into a weapon carried within the mouth of a beast. To the people who lived near volcanoes, it was almost as if the earth itself was a dragon, and the volcano its mouth. The flames and smoke were the breath, the lava its tongue, and the rumbling eruptions the growl of its throat. When we think of the way ancient people might have seen dinosaur bones, the picture grows even more striking. Consider the skull of a Tyrannosaurus, with teeth as long as a man's hand and jaws wide enough to crush bone. To someone without the knowledge of extinct species, such a skull could only have belonged to a monster. Or think of the ribs of a massive sauropod, so large that they could be mistaken for the remains of a giant serpent or dragon. Fossils preserved in volcanic stone would only strengthen the link between the fiery land and the monstrous bones. The very idea of fire breathing also connects to the natural world in other ways. Some animals today seem to produce effects that might look like fire to someone who does not understand them. The bombardier beetle, for example, can spray boiling hot liquid from its body, a defense mechanism that creates both heat and smoke. To an ancient observer, such an insect might seem to breathe fire in miniature. Scaling up such an idea to the size of a dinosaur would not have seemed impossible. Perhaps the bones of a giant beast were seen as belonging to a creature that once had such fiery powers, magnified to terrifying levels. Volcanoes themselves gave people many clues that could be woven into the dragon myth. The shapes of lava flows sometimes resemble twisting serpents, frozen in stone. The smoke and ash clouds from eruptions can take on shapes like wings or looming figures. The thunder and lightning that often accompany eruptions add to the sense of anger and fury, making the volcano seem alive. People living near such events would have no trouble seeing monsters in them, and when they uncovered strange bones nearby, the two mysteries might easily have become one story. The story of fire-spitting dragons. Even in lands far from volcanoes, the legend of the fire-breathing dragon may have reached people through travellers' tales. Merchants, sailors, and explorers carried stories with them across deserts, seas, and mountains. A story heard in Sicily about Mount Etna could find its way into the folklore of northern Europe. A tale told in Asia about dragon bones found in the earth could travel along the Silk Road and mix with stories of fiery mountains. By the time such stories reached new lands, they could be retold in countless variations, each culture adding its own details. The fire-breathing dragon became a shared image, born from a blend of fiery landscapes, fossil bones, and human imagination. The image of the dragon also carries deep symbolism. It represents fear of the uncontrollable, awe of the natural world, and respect for forces greater than human strength. A fire-breathing dragon is not just an animal, but a living volcano, a monster that carries within itself the destructive power of fire. In battling such a creature, heroes of legend were not only fighting a beast, but also confronting fire itself, an element that has always been both ally and enemy to humankind. Some ancient texts even describe battles with fiery monsters in terms that echo volcanic eruptions. The Norse myth of Fafnir, a dragon slain by the hero Sigurd, speaks of a beast guarding treasure, breathing poison and fire. In Mesopotamian myths, the monster Tiamat is described as a creature of chaos, spewing destructive force. These stories may not have come directly from volcanic eruptions, but the imagery is so similar that it is hard not to see the link. The fiery mouth of a beast and the fiery mouth of a volcano are two faces of the same mystery. Across cultures, dragons were often tied to the land itself. They might guard mountains, dwell in caves, or sleep beneath lakes and rivers. A dragon that lived in a volcano was only one step further in this pattern, tying the beast directly to the fire within the earth. To people who saw mountains erupt, the connection would have been clear, and to those who found bones nearby, the evidence seemed to support it. The dragon was not only real, but lived in the fiery heart of the world. The myths may have also been influenced by the sound of volcanoes. When a mountain rumbles before an eruption, the sound is like the growl of a giant beast. Explosions send shockwaves across the land, rattling windows and shaking the ground. To people living centuries ago, these sounds must have been terrifying, and the idea of a dragon roaring with fiery breath would have been a natural explanation. The earth shook, the sky glowed red, and the monster roared with fire. The vision of fire-spitting dragons has endured because it captures something deep in human imagination. It combines the mystery of the unknown with the fear of destruction. It ties together the bones of creatures long dead and the fire of the earth that still burns today. It is a story that connects the past to the present, the land to the sky, and humans to the forces of nature that they cannot control. Long before modern science gave people names like Protoceratops, fossils of this strange creature were already lying scattered across the burning deserts of Central Asia. Ancient travellers, traders, and storytellers stumbled upon them, their bones half buried under the shifting sands. They found skulls with curved beaks that looked like those of giant birds of prey, yet with bodies that were clearly not birds at all. These remains, bleached by centuries of sun and wind, stirred the imagination of those who lived or passed through the wide steppe lands. Among the people who wandered these territories, none were as influential in spreading tales as the Cythians, the fierce nomadic horsemen who roamed across the vast plains stretching from the Black Sea to the edge of Central Asia. The Cythians were known as warriors and herders, but also as traders who moved between worlds. Their journeys often took them into lands where mountains met deserts, where the earth cracked open to reveal hidden things, and where strange fossils lay exposed. The sight of Protoceratops' bones with their parrot-like skulls, hooked beaks, and squat reptilian bodies must have seemed both frightening and wondrous. They looked like creatures frozen between bird and beast, between eagle and lion, and this blurring of shapes fit neatly into the birth of myth. From such images, stories of griffins began to grow. A griffin, in Greek tales, was a creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. It was said to guard treasures hidden deep in the mountains, especially gold. These creatures were fierce and could not be tamed, and their legends travelled across lands carried by merchants and poets alike. But the roots of this idea, many scholars suggest, may have come not from thin air, but from real encounters with fossils in the very regions where the Scythians traded and camped, when Scythian riders saw Protoceratops skulls, with beak-like mouths that looked strikingly avian, yet placed on squat reptilian bodies with 4 strong legs. They may have told their neighbours about lion-bird creatures that once lived in the desert. The deserts of Mongolia and northern China, where Protoceratops remains are most abundant, were not silent lands. They were crossed by Silk Road caravans and tribal migrations. The sands did not simply bury bones, they also revealed them. Windstorms uncovered skeletons, leaving them lying in shallow basins waiting for curious eyes. Some skulls still bore the impression of the great neck frills that marked the species, giving them an even stranger appearance as though they wore crests or crowns. A Scythian finding such remains might not think of extinct reptiles, for that idea did not exist in the minds of people 2,000 or more years ago. Instead, he might see proof of a fierce guardian beast, long dead but still powerful enough to leave its bones behind. Gold mining in Central Asia may have pushed this connection further. Scythian traders were known for their wealth in gold, and stories of gold guarded by griffins reached Greek writers like Herodotus, who recorded that the Scythians spoke of such creatures. In reality, perhaps the Protoceratops fossils were near places where gold could also be found, leading to the impression that the beasts had once been guardians of the treasure. Imagine a prospector digging in the earth, finding glittering gold dust in a riverbed, and, nearby, stumbling upon the bleached skeleton of a Protoceratops. To him, this was not coincidence. It was a sign that the beast and the treasure were linked, that the bones were the remains of a guardian animal who once fought to protect the riches of the earth. The shape of the Protoceratops skull is striking. Its large beak curves downward like that of a powerful bird of prey. Its eyes are wide, set deep into the bone, giving it a fierce gaze even in death. Its frill extends from the back of the skull, rimmed with bony knobs, suggesting a kind of crown or collar. The rest of the body was smaller than that of a lion, but squat and muscular, with 4 sturdy legs and a long tail. To people who knew lions from their own hunting grounds and eagles from the sky, this combination of features seemed like a blend of both. No wings were present in the skeleton, yet imagination could supply them, for the skull already belonged to a bird and the body to a predator. The steppe storytellers, seeking to explain the strange fossils, may have said these creatures once had wings that had rotted away. What remained in the earth was only a shadow of their true form. As tales travelled, the griffin grew richer in detail. Greek vase painters drew them with sharp beaks and feathered wings, standing guard over piles of gold. Sculptors carved them onto shields and furniture. They were not always enemies in these stories, sometimes they were protectors, symbols of strength, or guardians of the divine. Yet the image of the griffin, half bird and half beast, fits so well with the Protoceratops that many modern paleontologists believe the link is more than chance. The Greeks heard of them from the Scythians, and the Scythians saw their bones in the deserts of Mongolia. The chain of myth stretched from fossil to tale to art. The Protoceratops lived more than 70 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous period, long before humans ever walked the earth. They were small compared to some of their dinosaur relatives, usually about 2 meters long, walking on all 4s and feeding on plants. They lived in herds, nesting together, as fossil beds show with eggs and juveniles preserved side by side. Sandstorms often buried them quickly, creating whole fields of skeletons locked in the stone of the Gobi Desert. Over time, wind and erosion revealed these graves. To a nomadic traveller stumbling upon such a scene, the bones might look like the remains of a lost age of monsters. Scythians, riding their swift horses across the steppe, had no concept of extinction or ancient ages of reptiles. To them, the world was full of spirits and beings whose presence lingered in strange places. Fossils were not curiosities, they were signs. They carried meaning. A skull with a beak like an eagle, but the jaws of a beast suggested a story waiting to be told. When combined with their knowledge of lions, the kings of the land, and eagles, the lords of the sky, the idea of a griffin was born naturally. A creature with the strength of a lion and the keen eyes and sharp beak of an eagle would indeed be a worthy guardian of treasure. Greek writers like Aeschylus, writing plays in the 5th century before the Common Era, described griffins in the northern lands beyond Scythia. Herodotus, who travelled widely and collected stories, recorded that the Cythians spoke of griffins in the deserts east of their lands. These accounts travelled into the heart of Greek culture, shaping art and imagination. Later, the Romans took up the image as well, decorating buildings and mosaics with griffins. Medieval Europe inherited the symbol, where griffins became emblems of courage, guardianship, and divine power. But behind all this long history of imagery may still lurk the bones of Protoceratops lying under Asian sands. The story of griffins guarding gold may also come from the very way fossils and minerals are found together. In dry lands, erosion exposes both. The same winds that sweep sand away from bones also reveal veins of ore or scatter flakes of gold into riverbeds. For ancient observers, there was no division between these finds. The earth revealed its secrets together, and so they were tied together in story. A skeleton nearby a gold deposit was not random, it was cause and effect. The creature had once guarded the treasure. The griffin lived, fought, and died in those hills, and its bones were the lasting proof of its role. The Scythians themselves were not passive carriers of tales. They were skilled metalworkers, creating ornaments in gold shaped like animals, birds, and hybrid creatures. Some of their jewellery even shows winged beasts with beaks, claws, and lion-like bodies. These objects were not simply art. They were part of a belief system in which animals carried power and meaning. A griffin-shaped ornament could protect its wearer, call upon strength, or symbolise a connection to the spirit world. When the Greeks saw Scythian jewellery, they did not only hear the stories but saw the images engraved in gold itself. The myth was reinforced by both word and art. Over centuries, the griffin became detached from its fossil roots. Few remembered the desert bones, but the symbol lived on. Yet in modern times, when paleontologists uncovered Protoceratops skeletons in Mongolia in the early 20th century, they noticed the same features that may have inspired the myth. The hooked beak, the crouched stance, the bird-like head attached to a quadruped's body. It all matched. Suddenly the connection between fossil and legend seemed possible once again, a bridge between ancient storytellers and modern scientists. Imagine a Scythian caravan pausing in the desert, their horses resting, while a scout finds a strange skull protruding from the sand. He brings it back to camp, and the elders examine it. They see its hooked beak, its powerful jaw, and its alien form. They debate what it means, and finally, they say it is the skull of a guardian beast, a griffin, who once kept watch over treasures buried in the earth. That night, as the fire crackles, the story spreads among the gathered riders, and in time, it passes on to foreign traders who will bring it to Greece. The fossil, silent and ancient, thus shapes the living myth of a people. Through these encounters, myth and reality wove together. The Scythians had no reason to separate them, and the Greeks eagerly absorbed stories that explained the mysterious edges of the world. The Protoceratops, though long extinct, became immortal in another way, not through its bones, but through the griffin that soared through imagination, guarding gold in stories and art for thousands of years. The idea of creatures that could change their form has haunted human imagination for thousands of years. Among the most fascinating of these tales are the stories of reptilian beings that could move not only between shapes, but also between worlds, slipping from the realm of water to the realm of land as if no barrier existed between them. These shapeshifters were said to glide through rivers and seas, then emerge onto the earth with clawed feet, armoured scales, and the gaze of cold-blooded predators. To early people who lived close to rivers, lakes, and oceans, such myths seemed perfectly possible. After all, the natural world was already filled with animals that blurred the line between domains. Crocodiles basked on riverbanks and then vanished beneath the current without a sound. Turtles laid their eggs on sandy shores but spent nearly all their lives in the ocean. Eels slipped from the sea into streams and swamps, travelling unseen through the mud. Amphibians like frogs and salamanders literally lived two lives, first as waterbound creatures and then as land dwellers. It was not such a great leap of thought to imagine that there might exist even stranger beings that could go further than nature's known boundaries, able to change their very shapes and appearances as they cross between water and land. In ancient times, rivers and seas were viewed not only as sources of life, but also as gates to the unknown. People saw the waters as both nurturing and dangerous, calm on one day and deadly on the next. Storms could rise without warning, floods could swallow entire villages, and whirlpools could drag boats beneath the surface. To explain such powers, many cultures invented tales of reptilian beings who ruled the waters and sometimes walked upon the earth. These creatures were not simply fish or snakes, but something stranger. Beings that could shift from one form to another depending on where they chose to roam. A snake might grow limbs and stride onto land as a dragon. A crocodile might shed its armoured skin to become a man who lived among people. A lizard might sink into the water only to emerge again as a monstrous serpent large enough to coil around a ship. In the stories told along the Nile in Egypt, the crocodile god Sobek embodied this dual nature. Sobek was feared and honoured because he lived in both worlds. He was a crocodile, but also a god who could appear in human form, sometimes with a crocodile's head, sometimes as a full reptile, and at other times as a man. His power lay in this very fluidity, for people saw in him the ability to move across boundaries that ordinary beings could not cross. He was a living shapeshifter, tied to the great river that gave Egypt its fertility, but also threatened it with floods and lurking crocodiles. The people prayed to him for protection from the creatures that prowled beneath the water, but they also called upon his fierce strength to protect their soldiers in battle. Far away in Mesopotamia, legend spoke of creatures known as the Apkallu, often shown as beings that were part fish and part man. These strange figures were said to have risen from the waters to teach humankind wisdom, crafts, and laws. Some versions of the myth suggested that they could slip between their reptilian or fish-like shapes and human form, acting as mediators between the watery depths and the dry earth. They carried the aura of mystery that came from the sea itself, a place of hidden knowledge and untold danger. The stories hinted that these beings were not limited to a single body but could transform as needed, walking on land in one guise and gliding back into the waters in another. In Greek tales too, shape-shifting reptiles found their place. The sea god Proteus was said to be able to take on any shape at will. Though not always imagined as reptilian, he was often connected with serpents and watery beasts. Sailors who tried to catch him spoke of his transformations. He became a serpent, a fish, a lion, or a dragon-like monster, all in an effort to escape capture. To the Greeks, such stories reflected the restless, unpredictable nature of the sea itself. Like Proteus, the sea was never fixed, never still. It shifted constantly, just as the god did, and it could never be fully grasped by human hands. The Norse people of the far north, surrounded by fjords and icy waters, imagined Jörmungandr, the great world serpent. Though he was primarily known as a giant sea serpent, some tales suggested he could move onto land as well, rising in terrible form to confront the gods at the end of time. He was a being of the water, yet his influence stretched to the land, where his movements caused earthquakes. In this way, he too was a kind of shapeshifter, not because he constantly changed his outward appearance, but because he belonged to both worlds and could strike fear whether he slithered beneath the waves or loomed above the land. In Asia, especially in Chinese traditions, dragons embodied the very essence of transformation between water and land. The Chinese dragon was unlike the fierce, fire-breathing beast imagined in the West. It was seen as a wise and noble creature, often tied to rivers, lakes, and rain. Dragons were said to dwell beneath the water in great palaces made of crystal and pearl. When they wished, they could rise into the sky, shaping clouds and bringing storms. At other times, they could crawl upon the land in the shape of serpents, or even take human form. Such dragons were masters of transformation, embodying the belief that water itself was a shifting, living force that could not be pinned down. They could appear as scaly reptiles, as human sages, or as colossal serpents coiled among the waves. In India, the Nagas were among the most famous reptilian shapeshifters. These serpent beings could live in rivers, lakes, or the depths of the underworld, but they could also walk upon the land in human form. Sometimes they appeared as serpents with many heads, sometimes as men or women with subtle reptilian traits, and sometimes as full humans hiding their true nature. To many, they were protectors of water and fertility, but to others they were dangerous, luring people into rivers or floods. Their dual nature symbolized the thin line between safety and danger, blessing and destruction. The Naga's ability to shift shapes and dwell in both water and land made them central figures in countless stories, often representing hidden powers that lay just beneath the surface of the natural world. In African traditions, too, myths of water reptiles that could change form were common. The waters of rivers like the Niger and the Congo were believed to house serpent spirits that could emerge onto the land as giant snakes or lizard-like monsters. In some stories, they could even disguise themselves as human beings to interact with villages, only to reveal their true reptilian forms later. These tales reflected the intimate relationship people had with water, which gave life through fishing and farming, but could also bring destruction through floods, drowning, and disease. To imagine a shape-shifting reptile living in those waters was to give a face to the mysteries and dangers of nature. Among Native American tribes, there were many stories of water serpents and reptilian beings with the power to change shapes. The horned serpent was one such figure, often described as a great serpent with scales that shone like gems. It could live in lakes and rivers, but was also said to rise onto the land, appearing in different forms to humans. Sometimes it would appear as a massive snake, sometimes as a dragon-like monster, and in rare tales it could even take on the form of a human. To the people who told these stories, such beings were both feared and respected, embodying the power of water and the mysteries that lay within it. In South America, legends of reptilian beings that moved between water and land also thrived. The stories of the Yakumama, or Mother of Waters, told of a giant snake that lived in the Amazon River. This snake was said to be so large that it could swallow entire boats. It was believed that the Yakumama could sometimes rise onto land, crushing trees in its path, or disguise itself to lure prey. Such a creature, shifting between domains, was a powerful way of explaining the awe and danger of the vast rivers that ran through the jungles. The belief that it could change form or appearance added to its mystery and kept people wary of the hidden forces in the water. Even in European folklore, long after Christianity had spread across the continent, tales of reptilian shapeshifters endured. There were stories of water dragons or serpent-like beings that could rise from lakes and transform into humans. Some were said to seduce men or women, only to reveal their monstrous natures when it was too late. Others were guardians of treasure hidden beneath the water, appearing sometimes as humans and sometimes as scaled beasts. These tales often blended with older pagan beliefs about water spirits, keeping alive the idea that creatures existed which could cross between forms and between realms. The fascination with reptiles as shapeshifters may have been rooted in the very nature of reptiles themselves. Many reptiles already seemed mysterious to ancient eyes. Snakes shed their skins, appearing reborn in gleaming new scales. Turtles and crocodiles could vanish into the water and reappear on land without warning. Lizards could regrow lost tails, as though they possessed magical powers of renewal. Amphibians blurred the line even further, starting life in one form and ending in another. To ancient observers, these natural transformations may have seemed like hints of even greater powers, inspiring myths of reptiles that could change entirely from water beings to land creatures. The belief in reptilian shapeshifters also reflected a deeper human feeling, the sense that the natural world was never entirely trustworthy, that something could change suddenly and reveal a hidden truth. Calm waters could become deadly floods. A harmless-looking stream could hide a crocodile beneath its surface. A snake might lie still as a stick, only to strike in an instant. The myths gave voice to this uncertainty, showing reptiles as beings whose very nature was to shift, to change, to keep their true essence hidden until the moment they revealed it. Some storytellers may have been inspired by encounters with fossils, bones, and remains of ancient creatures. The skull of a dinosaur unearthed by erosion might suggest a monster that was part reptile, part fish, able to move between domains. The shell of a giant prehistoric turtle or the skeleton of a plesiosaur could easily spark tales of water-dwelling reptiles that sometimes came ashore. Without the knowledge of paleontology, ancient people might have woven these strange discoveries into their myths, creating stories of shapeshifters to explain the evidence before their eyes. The tales of reptilian shapeshifters spread across cultures and across time because they touched something universal in human experience. They spoke of the unknown lurking beneath the water, of the thin line between familiar and strange, of creatures that could not be fully trusted because their very bodies could change. They also reflected the awe people felt toward reptiles themselves, creatures so different from mammals and birds, so alien in their cold, scaled forms. By imagining reptiles as beings that could transform, people expressed both their fear and their respect for the hidden powers of nature. Terasaurs were seen as one of the most puzzling groups of dinosaurs ever discovered. Their bodies seemed to be a strange mix of features that looked like they belonged to completely different kinds of dinosaurs. On top of that, very few fossils of these animals had been found, which made it extremely difficult for scientists to figure out where they belonged in the family tree of dinosaurs. Because of this, their evolutionary relationships were debated and argued over for many decades after they were first discovered. The first genus of this group, called Therasinosaurus, was not even recognized as a dinosaur at first. When it was described in the year 1954, based only on some enormous arm bones and claws, scientists actually thought it belonged to a kind of giant turtle. This mistake shows just how confusing these creatures were. It was only many years later, in the year 1979, that the Mongolian paleontologist Altangiral Pearl studied fossils of another dinosaur, called Segnosaurus. He noticed that this animal seemed to represent a new kind of dinosaur family. Pearl tentatively placed them among the theropods, the group usually known as the meat-eating dinosaurs, like Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor. He created a new family for Segnosaurus, which he named Segnosauridae, with Segnosaurus as the main and only member. He distinguished this family from two other strange theropod groups known at the time, Dinochairidae and Therizinosauridae. Both of those groups were only known from gigantic arms found in Mongolia, belonging to the mysterious dinosaurs Dinochairus and Therizinosaurus. Pearl said that Segnosauridae could be separated from them based on differences in their upper arm bones and their massive hand claws. Later that same year, in 1979, Pearl, together with another famous Mongolian paleontologist, Rinchen Barsbold, found that the hips of these dinosaurs were very different from those of other theropods. They even looked so unusual, when compared to the hips of another group, the dromaeosaurs, that Barsbold and Pearl suggested they should be placed in three separate groups of equal importance, perhaps at the level of infraorder, within the great division of dinosaurs known as Saurischia. This was one of the two major branches of dinosaurs, the other being Ornithischia, the so-called bird-hipped dinosaurs. In the year 1980, Barsbold and Pearl officially created this new infraorder, which they called Segnosauria, to contain the Segnosauridae. In that same study, they also introduced a brand new genus named Erlikosaurus, based on a beautifully preserved skull and parts of a skeleton. Erlikosaurus was considered part of the Segnosaurids, and they also described a pelvis belonging to another, yet unidentified member of this group, all found in the same rock layers where Segnosaurus had been discovered. For the first time, scientists now had relatively complete evidence about this strange family. The animals were united by features such as a backward-pointing pelvis, a slender lower jaw, and a toothless beak at the front of their mouths. Barsbold and Pearl admitted that in some ways these dinosaurs looked a little like the plant-eating Ornithischians and the long-necked sauropods, but they argued that these similarities were only superficial. When studied more closely, the bones showed clear differences. They suggested that although Segnosaurians were different from other theropods, perhaps because they had split off early in their evolution, they still belonged with them. Because the Erlikosaurus skeleton did not include a pelvis, the authors were uncertain whether the unidentified pelvis they had could belong to Erlikosaurus. If it did not, then it might represent a different family of its own. Even though Erlikosaurus and Segnosaurus were hard to compare directly because both were incomplete, Pearl argued in 1981 that there was no good reason to place Erlikosaurus in a separate family. Then, in 1982, Pearl reported new discoveries, pieces of hind legs that were very similar to those of Segnosaurus. He connected them to Therizinosaurus, whose enormous arms had been discovered not far from the same spot. This convinced him that Therizinosauridae, Dinochairidae, and Segnosauridae, three groups with gigantic forelimbs, were actually part of one and the same larger group. Since Segnosaurus and Therizinosaurus seemed particularly similar, Pearl suggested that they probably belonged together in a single family, while Dinochairus might need to be excluded. Today we know that Dinochairus was not closely related, but instead was a very large bizarre member of the ostrich mimic group called Ornithomemosaurs. In 1983, Barsbold agreed that Segnosaurus and Erlikosaurus should remain in Segnosauridae, but he also named yet another genus, called Enigmasaurus, based on the mysterious pelvis that had been discovered earlier. He even gave it its own family, Enigmasauridae, within Segnosauria. Since the pelvis of Erlikosaurus was still unknown, he reasoned that the strange pelvis could not belong to it, because Segnosaurus and Erlikosaurus were already so similar in other ways, while Enigmasaurus's hips looked very different. Barsbold remarked that Segnosaurids were so unusual compared to normal theropods that they either represented an extreme deviation in theropod evolution, or perhaps they had crossed beyond the borders of theropods altogether. Still, he preferred to keep them inside the theropod group for the time being. In that same year, Barsbold also pointed out how the hips of Segnosaurians were very different from typical theropod hips, and that in fact the upper parts of their hip bones looked more like those of the giant long-necked sauropods. A few years later, in 1984, the American paleontologist Gregory S. Paul entered the debate with a bold new idea. He argued that Segnosaurians were not theropods at all. In his view, they lacked any true theropod features. Instead, he thought they were late surviving relatives of the old prosauropods, the early plant-eating dinosaurs that lived long before the Jurassic giants. According to him, Segnosaurians had features of prosauropods in their jaws, snouts, and feet. At the same time, they had resemblances to ornithischians in their cheeks, palates, and hips. To him, they seemed to be an intermediate group between prosauropods and ornithischians. In other words, he believed they were living remnants of a great transition that had taken place way back in the Triassic period. He compared their role in the dinosaur world to the role of monotremes among mammals, strange survivors of an ancient lineage that looked like a bridge between different worlds. Paul admitted it was not impossible that Segnosaurians had evolved from theropods, or that all three groups, Segnosaurians, prosauropods, and ornithischians, had separately developed from early dinosaurs, but he found those alternatives unlikely. Instead, he believed their similarities supported the idea that all dinosaurs had a common ancestor, meaning they formed a single natural group. At that time, this was still debated, as some paleontologists thought that different dinosaur groups might have evolved separately from older reptiles called the codonts. Paul's views sparked lively debates. In 1985, the British paleontologist David Norman remarked that Paul's suggestion was bound to stir controversy. And indeed it did. By 1988, Paul continued to argue that Segnosaurians were late-surviving ornithischian-like prosauropods. He even proposed that Therizinosaurus itself belonged to this group. He placed Segnosaurians in a new higher-level category called Phytodinosauria, which had been introduced in 1985 by paleontologist Robert Bakker to group together all plant-eating dinosaurs. In 1986, the American paleontologist Jacques Gautier studied the relationships of Saurischian dinosaurs and also concluded that Segnosaurians were prosauropods. He admitted they had some similarities with theropods and ornithischians, but he suggested these features had evolved independently rather than through close relationships. A few years later, in 1989, Paul Sereno also supported the idea that Segnosaurians were prosauropods, basing his conclusion on details of their skulls. In the year 1990, two paleontologists, Rinchen Barsbold and Teresa Marianska, published a detailed review article in which they described the group Segnosauria as something very unusual and puzzling. They called these dinosaurs rare and aberrant, meaning that their bodies looked different from the usual kinds of dinosaurs known at the time. The fossils of these animals did not easily fit into the neat categories that scientists had built for dinosaur families. Because of this, Barsbold and Marianska placed Segnosauria in an uncertain position within the great dinosaur order Saurischia. They were unsure whether these strange creatures were closer to the long-necked sauropodomorphs or to the meat-eating theropods, though they leaned toward them being more like the former. To reflect this uncertainty, they labelled the group with the Latin phrase Saurischia sedis mutabilis, which means their position is subject to change. At that time, there was also a debate about the giant Therizinosaurus. Back in the year 1982, some hind limb bones had been connected to Therizinosaurus, and these looked very much like they belonged to Segnosaurians. While Barsbold and Marianska admitted that the hind limbs were indeed Segnosaurian in nature, they did not think this was enough evidence to firmly call Therizinosaurus itself a Segnosaur. After all, the famous dinosaur was only known from its massive forelimbs with enormous claws, and without more complete skeletons, they were cautious about making bold claims. A major breakthrough came in the year 1993, when paleontologists Dale Russell and Dong Jiming described a brand new dinosaur genus from China, which they named Alxosaurus. This discovery was extraordinary because it was, at that time, the most complete large theropod skeleton ever found from that era and region. Alxosaurus was fascinating. In some ways, its body reminded scientists of the earlier plant-eating prosauropods, but when they studied its arms and legs in detail, they found clear similarities with both Therizinosaurus and other Segnosaurs. Unlike Therizinosaurus, which was known mostly from arms, Alxosaurus preserved both its forelimbs and hind limbs. This allowed Russell and Dong to prove that the hind limbs earlier assigned to Therizinosaurus by the Mongolian paleontologist Altangirel Pearl were indeed correctly identified. Because of this, Russell and Dong suggested a new arrangement. They argued that the family name Segnosauridae was actually just another name for Therizinosauridae, which had been coined earlier and therefore had priority. In their view, Alxosaurus was now the best-known representative of the group, providing an important window into their anatomy and lifestyle. They even created a higher-level group, which they called Therizinosauridae, to contain both Alxosaurus and the family Therizinosauridae. They placed this supergroup inside the theropod subgroup called Tetanuri. When comparing evolutionary relationships, Russell and Dong thought Therizinosaurs were most closely related to fast-running ornithomimids, clever troodontids, and the peculiar oviraptorids. They gathered all these lineages under the group Oviraptorosauria, since they doubted the traditional grouping known as Maniraptora, believing it was not valid at that time. The suggestion that Segnosauridae and Therizinosauridae were the same group was soon accepted by Pearly himself and his collaborators when they redescribed the skull of Erlikosaurus in the year 1994. Their study went further, concluding that Therizinosaurs were indeed Maniraptoran theropods, which is the same great branch of dinosaurs that includes modern birds. They also carefully examined earlier theories that connected Therizinosaurs with the plant-eating Ornithischians, or with the long-necked sauropods, and they pointed out multiple flaws in those older ideas. Not everyone was convinced, however. In the year 1995, the Russian paleontologist Lev Alexandrovich Nesov disagreed and argued that Therizinosaurs were not theropods at all. Instead, he considered them a unique and separate group within Saurischia. A year later, in 1996, another researcher, Thomas Holtz Jr., conducted a new evolutionary analysis of the Coelurosaurian theropods and placed Therizinosaurs closer to the Oviraptorosaurs. Then, in the year 1999, Chinese paleontologist Xing Xu and his colleagues introduced the world to yet another groundbreaking discovery, Beipiaosaurus. This small, primitive Therizinosauride from China provided a missing link. It confirmed beyond doubt that Therizinosaurs were indeed Coelurosaurian theropods. Its skeleton revealed traits seen in earlier theropods, in Coelurosaurs, and in Therizinosaurs, showing a fascinating mixture of features. For the first time, a full evolutionary tree called a cladogram was published, clearly placing Therizinosauria among the theropods. That same year, another scientist, Paul Sereno, put forward a slightly different idea, suggesting that Therizinosaurs might actually be very primitive members of the Ornithomimosaur lineage. By the beginning of the 21st century, new discoveries continued to pour in. Fossils of Therizinosaurs were no longer confined to Asia. For example, the dinosaur Nothronicus was unearthed in North America, showing that these strange creatures had once roamed far and wide. Another important find was Falcarius, a more primitive form from North America, which helped to reveal the early stages in the evolution of the group. Scientists began to realize that Therizinosaurs were not as rare or as odd as once thought. Instead, they were a widespread and diverse group, ranging in size from smaller forms to enormous giants. By this time, most paleontologists agreed they were Maniraptoran theropods. Still, arguments remained about exactly where within Maniraptora they belonged. In the year 2007, Alan Turner and colleagues grouped them with the Oviraptorosaurs, while in the year 2009, Lindsay Zano and her team argued that Therizinosaurs were the most primitive branch within Maniraptora, positioned between Ornithomimosaurs and Alvarezsaurs. Even though new fossils were being uncovered, the relationships among the different Therizinosaur species were still tangled and unclear. By the year 2010, Zano had conducted the most detailed analysis yet of Therizinosaur evolution. She explained that the biggest challenges were the poor condition of many type specimens, the lack of skull material, and the fragmentary nature of most fossils. Many original fossils had even been damaged, lost, or were hard to access, making careful comparisons nearly impossible. Decades later, discoveries still continued. In the year 2023, researchers David Wills, Charlie Underwood and Paul Barrett studied a single tooth found in the Chipping Norton limestone of England. This rock dated all the way back to the Bathonian stage of the Middle Jurassic period. To everyone's surprise, they determined that the tooth belonged to a Therazinosauroid. This made it not only the oldest record of the group, but also the very first evidence of Therazinosauroidea in Europe. The story of Therizinosaurs also involved several confusing cases of misidentification. In the year 1979, Dong Jiming had named a new species of the predatory dinosaur Chelantosaurus, calling it Chelantosaurus zhejiangensis. This was based on a specimen collected in 1972 that included part of a shin bone and part of a foot. Later, in the year 1990, Busbold and Marianska suggested that this species was not really a Chelantosaurus at all, but perhaps a Segnosaur, because its toes and claws looked more like those of Segnosaurus. Over the years, several paleontologists revisited the specimen, and by the 2010s, some argued it was indeed a Therizinosaur. In 2012, Mai-Ping Qian and colleagues placed it firmly within the Therizinosauridae family based on the shape of its foot. Later, in 2019, Matthew Hartman and his team included it in an evolutionary analysis and found it to belong to the broader group Therazinosauroidea, close to Alxosaurus and Enigmasaurus. Another confusing case came in the year 1997, when Dong Jiming and Yu Hailu described what they thought was a second species of Nanshungosaurus, which they called Nanshungosaurus bolini. The fossil was discovered in 1992 and consisted of 11 neck vertebrae and 5 back vertebrae. They even created a new family, Nanshungosauridae, to hold both this species and the earlier Nanshungosaurus brevispinus. However, later studies found little clear evidence that N. bolini really belonged to Nanshungosaurus. In 2007, a group of scientists argued that it might actually be the same as Sujosaurus, since they came from the same geological layers. Unfortunately, because the fossils of N. bolini were incomplete and even apparently lost, direct comparisons were nearly impossible. By 2010, Lindsay Zano concluded that the traits used to describe N. bolini were not unique, and in 2019, Hartman and his colleagues placed it in a clade of Therizinosaurids that also included Segnosaurus and Nothronicus. Around the year 2005, partial fossils of another Therizinosaur were collected from the Lagia Formation in China. These bones were later informally referred to as Tiantaiosaurus siphongensis, or sometimes Tiantaiosaurus. A manuscript describing the supposed new species had already been written in 2007, but for reasons not entirely clear, it was never formally published. To this day, it remains an unpublished and uncertain name in the shadowy corners of Therizinosaur research. In the year 1998, two Chinese paleontologists Zhao Xijin and Xu Xing made a fascinating find in the Lufeng Formation of Yunnan Province, a region famous for its early Jurassic rocks. While exploring, they uncovered part of a lower jaw containing several teeth, a specimen later catalogued as IVPP 11579. Though incomplete, this jawbone was thought to represent something extraordinary. Zhao and Xu suggested that it was the earliest known evidence of a Coelurosaurian theropod, one of the great lineages of predatory dinosaurs that would eventually give rise to birds. They reached this conclusion mainly by studying the shape and form of the teeth, which they believed resembled those of Therizinosaurs. This specimen was not left in obscurity. In the year 2001, it was carefully described in detail, and used as the basis for naming a completely new genus and species, Aschanosaurus deguchianis, a name formerly proposed by Xu Xing and his colleagues. They reinforced their argument that the unusual teeth belonged to a Therizinosaur and not to the long-necked sauropodomorphs that dominated the early Jurassic. However, that very same year, paleontologists James Kirkland and Douglas Wolfe challenged this idea, pointing out that the fossil preserved features typically found in sauropodomorphs. Years later, in 2009, British paleontologist Paul Barrett re-examined the specimen closely. He noted 6 distinctive traits that matched Therizinosaurs but were absent in prosauropods, agreeing that Aschanosaurus should indeed be regarded as one of these strange clawed dinosaurs. Therizinosaurs themselves were a peculiar bunch, ranging widely in size. At the smaller end there was Bapiosaurus, which measured around 2 1/5 meters in length, and Jianchangosaurus, which reached about 2 meters long. Mid-sized giants like Segnosaurus and Sujosaurus stretched to about 6 to 7 meters in length. Towering above them all was Therizinosaurus, the namesake of the group, which could grow up to a staggering 10 meters in length and tip the scales at more than 5 tons. This made it one of the largest theropods ever known, despite its plant-eating habits. Physically, Therizinosaurs were unlike any other dinosaurs. They had long, graceful necks and wide, barrel-shaped bodies. Their hind feet bore 4 weight-bearing toes, making them look more like early sauropodomorphs than predatory theropods. Their hip bones, oddly shaped and pointing backwards, reminded paleontologists of the so-called bird-hipped Ornithischians. But what truly set them apart were their hands, which carried massive claws. In Therizinosaurus, these claws could reach about 1 full meter in length, longer than a man's arm. Their arms themselves had a surprising range of motion, allowing them to stretch forward in ways no other theropod could. This adaptation likely helped them strip leaves and branches, much like later mammals such as giant ground sloths, great apes, or even modern-day pandas that use their dexterous limbs to feed. Fossilized skin impressions from Bepiausaurus reveal that these dinosaurs were not bare-skinned, but rather covered in downy, feather-like filaments. They even had longer quill-like feathers that might have been used for display, making them appear stranger still. The naming history of this group is equally fascinating. In the year 1980, 2 Mongolian paleontologists, Rinchen Barsbold and Altangarel Perle, first named them Segnosauria, considering them a distinct infraorder of theropods. Later, in an attempt to separate them further, Dong Jiming placed them in their own order, Segnosauritia. However, as more fossils were uncovered, it became clear that these animals were specialized theropods, and the name Segnosauritia was abandoned. In 1997, Dale Russell introduced the name Therazinosauria, which has since become the accepted term. The superfamily name Therazinosauroidea was proposed even earlier, in 1993, but without a precise definition. Meanwhile, the family Therizinosauridae had already been established back in 1954 by the Russian paleontologist Evgeny Maleev, originally to house only Therizinosaurus. Over time, however, it became clear that this family contained a much greater diversity of species. Therazinosauria is formally defined as the group including genera such as Alxosaurus, Enigmasaurus, Erlikosaurus, Nanchungosaurus, Segnosaurus, and Therizinosaurus, along with all dinosaurs more closely related to them than to Oviraptorosaurs, Ornithomimids, or Troodontids. In 2005, Paul Sereno refined this definition to include Therizinosaurus, but exclude other well-known theropods such as Ornithomimus, Oviraptor, Shibuya, Tyrannosaurus, and Troodon. As paleontologists learned that Therizinosaurus was a highly advanced member of the group, closely tied to Alxosaurus, the superfamily Therizinosauridae was coined to include both Therizinosauridae and Alxosaurus. This term gradually replaced the older Segnosauria, which had long been tied to the outdated belief that these dinosaurs were early relatives of prosauropods. By 2001, Zhang and colleagues formally defined Therizinosauridae as including all theropods closer to Therizinosaurus than to modern birds. Later, in 2004, James Clark offered a narrower definition, the last common ancestor of Therizinosaurus and Bepiausaurus, and all of its descendants. This allowed the name Therazinosauria to remain useful for the broader group, while Therizinosauridae was used for a more specific branch. This approach has since been adopted by several researchers, including Paul Sereno in 2005, Lindsay Zano in 2009, and again in 2010. The anatomy of therizinosaurs has also been explored in remarkable detail. In 2012, Stefan Lautenschlager and his colleagues used CT scanning to study the skull of Erlikosaurus. Their research revealed that this dinosaur had a relatively large forebrain, as well as finely tuned senses of balance, hearing, and smell. Such abilities would have been invaluable for avoiding predators, locating food, and perhaps even engaging in complex social behaviours. These advanced traits likely came from their carnivorous ancestors, but were adapted to suit their unusual plant-based diets. Evidence of their reproduction has also come to light. In 2007, Martin Kundrat and his team described fossilized dinosaur eggs containing well-developed embryos from the Nanchow Formation. These eggs, belonging to the type known as Dendrolithidae, were identified as Therizinosaurian. The embryo's bones were already heavily ossified, suggesting that the hatchlings were precocial, able to move about and feed on their own immediately after hatching. Their teeth indicated an omnivorous diet, and the underground nests in which the eggs were found suggest that parents did not remain to guard them. Further discoveries were reported in 2013 when Yoshitsugu Kobayashi and colleagues announced a remarkable nesting ground uncovered at the Javklant Formation. This site preserved at least 17 separate egg clutches within a single layer of rock, spread across an area measuring 22 meters by 52 meters. Each clutch contained about 8 round eggs, their rough surface shells touching one another and arranged in circular patterns. Microscopic studies of the eggshells confirmed that they belonged to the Dendrolithidae type, again linked to Therizinosaurs. Although no adult Therizinosaurs have been discovered in the Javklant Formation itself, the layer lies just above the Bayan-Shira Formation, where fossils of Segnosaurus, Erlikosaurus, and Enigmasaurus are well known. The sheer number of clutches suggests that these dinosaurs gathered in colonies to nest, much like hadrosaurs, titanosaurs, and even birds. Yet the fact that all the eggs were laid during a single nesting event shows that they did not return to the same site year after year. This discovery remains the largest known nesting colony of non-avian theropods in Asia, and the very first to show colonial behaviour in this group. Carnotaurus was one of the strangest and most fascinating dinosaurs to ever walk the earth. Its name means meat-eating bull, and it was given this title because of the short but sharp horns that grew above its eyes. These horns gave it a look unlike almost any other predator of its time. Most meat-eating dinosaurs had sharp teeth, strong jaws, and powerful legs, but Carnotaurus carried all of these weapons along with something extra that made it stand out: the appearance of a bull combined with the speed and agility of a hunter. This dinosaur lived during the late Cretaceous period, about 72 million years ago, in what is today South America. The land it roamed was a very different place back then. South America was a hot and lush continent filled with thick forests, wide floodplains, and many rivers. Huge herbivorous dinosaurs such as sauropods wandered the land, while armoured dinosaurs and duck-billed dinosaurs moved in large herds. In this world of giants, Carnotaurus carved out a place for itself as one of the fastest and most unusual predators. The discovery of Carnotaurus is also a fascinating story. In the year 1984, an Argentinian paleontologist named José Bonaparte uncovered its skeleton in Argentina. This find was extremely important because the skeleton was nearly complete, which is rare when it comes to dinosaur fossils. It gave scientists a very clear picture of what this animal looked like, from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail. When the bones were studied carefully, paleontologists were amazed at the strange mixture of features it carried. They realized right away that this dinosaur was not just another large predator like Tyrannosaurus or Allosaurus, but something unique with its own role in prehistoric life. One of the first things anyone notices about Carnotaurus is its head. It had a very short and deep skull, almost like the face of a bulldog, but stretched into the form of a dinosaur. On top of its skull were 2 thick horns, each about 20 centimeters long. These horns were not enormous like those of a Triceratops, but they were still impressive, and they made Carnotaurus look very intimidating. Scientists have long debated the purpose of these horns. Some believe they were used for fighting members of their own kind, perhaps locking horns and shoving against each other the way modern bulls or deer do. Others suggest the horns may have been used mainly for display, to show off strength and attract mates, or to frighten rivals. Whatever their true purpose, the horns made Carnotaurus instantly recognizable. The jaws of Carnotaurus were lined with sharp teeth, but they were quite small compared to those of other big predators like Tyrannosaurus rex. Its bite force may not have been as powerful, but its skull was built for speed. The jaws could snap shut quickly, allowing Carnotaurus to catch smaller and more agile prey. This dinosaur probably did not specialize in taking down massive sauropods. Instead, it likely chased after swift herbivores, using its speed to outmaneuver them and its quick bite to inflict wounds. Speaking of speed, Carnotaurus was built like a sprinter. Its legs were long and strong, with muscles that suggested it could run very fast for a dinosaur of its size. Scientists think it may have been one of the fastest large predators of the late Cretaceous, perhaps reaching speeds close to that of a modern-day horse. This speed gave it a great advantage when hunting, as it could dash after nimble prey in open landscapes. The tail of Carnotaurus was also special. It was unusually stiff and straight, supported by long bones that locked it in place. This stiff tail worked like a balancing rod, helping the dinosaur stay stable as it sprinted at high speeds. Another feature that makes Carnotaurus truly fascinating is its arms. Most meat-eating dinosaurs had small arms compared to their bodies, but Carnotaurus took this to the extreme. Its arms were tiny, even more reduced than those of Tyrannosaurus rex. In fact, they were so short that they looked almost useless. The hands had 4 fingers, but the fingers were fused and almost clawless, making them incapable of grasping or tearing. Some scientists believe the arms may not have been used at all, while others suggest they had a role in balance or movement. Whatever their purpose, the arms were comically small compared to the rest of the body, giving Carnotaurus one of the strangest body shapes in the dinosaur kingdom. The skin of Carnotaurus is another detail that makes it special. Fossil impressions found with the skeleton reveal the texture of its skin, which is something very rare in paleontology. The skin was covered with small scales and dotted with rows of larger bumps, almost like armoured studs. This gave it a rough, crocodile-like appearance. The scales did not form protective plates like those of an ankylosaur, but they may have helped the dinosaur defend itself from bites or scratches during fights. They may also have played a role in thermoregulation, helping Carnotaurus manage heat in the warm climate of South America. Carnotaurus was not a giant compared to some of its relatives, but it was still an impressive predator. It measured about 9 meters in length from nose to tail and weighed around 1.5 tons. That made it smaller than Tyrannosaurus, but still large enough to dominate its environment. Its height was about 3 meters at the hips, giving it a powerful presence as it strode across the ancient plains. The environment in which Carnotaurus lived was filled with challenges. South America during the late Cretaceous was a land of change, with volcanic activity, shifting rivers, and rich vegetation. Herds of plant-eating dinosaurs roamed in large numbers, and Carnotaurus likely relied on stealth, speed, and power to hunt them down. It may have ambushed prey near watering holes or chased them in open areas, using its quick bursts of speed to catch victims before they could escape. Because Carnotaurus was found in South America, it belonged to a special group of theropods known as abelisaurids. These were predators that lived mainly in the southern continents, which had broken away from the northern continents long before. Abelisaurids were different from the more famous predators like Tyrannosaurus, which ruled North America. Instead, they developed their own unique forms. Carnotaurus, with its horns, short face, and tiny arms, was one of the most advanced members of this family. Scientists continue to study Carnotaurus to better understand how it lived and hunted. Computer models of its skull suggest it could open its jaws extremely wide, which may have allowed it to deliver fast-slashing bites. Studies of its legs and muscles support the idea that it was one of the swiftest hunters of its time. Research on its skin gives hints about how it looked and how it might have survived in its hot environment. Each discovery adds more detail to the picture of this extraordinary predator. Even today, Carnotaurus captures the imagination of people around the world. Its strange mixture of features makes it a favourite in books, documentaries, and movies. The horns give it a fearsome appearance, the tiny arms make it look bizarre, and its speed and hunting skills add excitement to its legend.